Hello beautiful people. Welcome to The Fiction Wizard. In today's episode, we explore Snape sent every memory of the Dursleys to Amelia Bones that night, and never told Dumbledore. Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The night he followed the owl arrived at Spinner's End just after 9 in the evening, and Severus Snape read the letter twice before he threw it into the fire. Not because he disbelieved it. Because he did. Voldemort was gone. The Dark Lord, the man whose service Snape had bought with Lily Evans' name, was gone, destroyed by a child not yet 2 years old, and the letter from Dumbledore was warm and careful and full of the particular brand of gentleness that meant the old man was managing him. Rejoice, the letter said, among other things. We have won a great victory. There was a postscript about returning to Hogwarts when Snape was ready, about resuming his post, about the work that remained. There was no mention of Lily. Snape stood at the window and watched the burning letter curl black and fall apart, and he thought about the fact that Dumbledore had promised him. He had promised her protection. He had looked Snape in the eye and given his word, and then he had failed so completely that a 15-month-old boy had been forced to do what the most powerful wizard in Britain could not. Lily Potter was dead. James Potter was dead. Peter Pettigrew was dead, apparently. The reports were fragmented and wild, and Sirius Black had been taken to Azkaban without a trial, which was the sort of detail that might have troubled Snape more if he'd had any room left in him for anything beyond the specific, grinding weight of Lily being gone. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the empty fireplace with the ash of Dumbledore's letter on the grate, and he thought about Harry Potter. He hadn't meant to think about Harry Potter. He'd been actively avoiding it, the same way you avoid pressing on a bruise, not because the bruise isn't there, but because pressing it won't help and you already know it hurts. But the thinking came anyway, crawling in through the gaps. Lily's son. Lily's eyes, supposedly, if you believed James Potter had ever been capable of describing anything accurately. A child alone now, or as good as alone, and Dumbledore would have a plan. Dumbledore always had a plan. That was the part that started pulling at something in Snape's chest. He got up at 10:30. He told himself he was going for a walk. He told himself this with enough conviction that he even believed it for the first 5 minutes, out in the cold November air with his coat pulled close and the streetlights of Cokeworth guttering in the wind. He walked north. He kept walking. He told himself he didn't know where he was going. He operated just outside Little Whinging at 11:15, because walking from Cokeworth to Surrey would have taken until morning and some things, even for Severus Snape, required a certain honesty. He found Privet Drive without difficulty. It was exactly the kind of street he'd expected, relentlessly tidy, uniformly beige, radiating the particular suburban virtue of people who'd never once had an interesting thought. Number 4 had a car in the drive and a wind chime by the door and flower boxes in the windows that were empty now because it was November and whoever lived here clearly maintained their flower boxes seasonally and on schedule, which told you almost everything you needed to know. And on the doorstep, wrapped in a blanket that was too thin for the temperature, sat a wicker basket containing Harry Potter. Snape stood across the street in the shadow of a privet hedge, yes, the irony of the hedge was not lost on him, and stared. He could feel Dumbledore's enchantments on the street even from here, the gentle persuasive magic that made ordinary people look away and find somewhere else to be. He'd been trained by the same man, though, and he knew how to let the enchantment slide past him like water. The basket was real. The child was real. He could see the rise and fall of the blanket from here, the small hitching breath of an infant sleeping in the cold, and there was a letter tucked under the edge of the blanket that Snape recognized as Dumbledore's handwriting even from this distance. He stood there for a long time. He didn't go across. He'd thought about it, standing in his kitchen 3 hours ago, thought about picking the child up, taking him somewhere, doing something, but where would he take him? To whom? He was a Death Eater on the wrong side of a war that had just ended, his credibility entirely dependent on Dumbledore's protection, and walking through Wizarding Britain with Lily's orphaned son tucked under his arm was not a plan so much as a series of increasingly bad consequences. He knew that. He'd thought it through clearly. What he hadn't accounted for was having to watch. The light came on in the upstairs window at 11:43. Snape noted the time with the automatic precision of a man who'd spent years in situations where time was the difference between living and dying. A shape moved behind the frosted glass of the bathroom, large, bulky, the movements of someone who'd been woken unexpectedly. Then nothing for a while. Then the shape appeared again, moving toward the back of the house, and the kitchen light came on downstairs, and Snape watched Vernon Dursley, because that was who this must be, Petunia's husband, the wide man with the mustache he'd seen once in a photograph Lily had shown him years ago with the expression of someone displaying a particularly embarrassing medical condition, watched Vernon Dursley stand at his kitchen window and drink a glass of water and look out at his back garden and then look at the ceiling. He didn't look at the front door. He went back to bed. At midnight the wind picked up and the blanket around Harry slipped partially off. The child made a sound, not quite crying, more the precursor to it, the hitching escalation of a baby deciding whether the situation warranted full outrage, and Snape crossed the street before he'd consciously decided to move, reached down, and tucked the blanket back. Harry Potter opened his eyes. They were green. They were exactly and precisely Lily's eyes, the same shade, the same shape, the same quality of looking at things as though they were worth examining properly, and Snape crouched on the cold front step of number 4 Privet Drive and stared into them for somewhere between 2 seconds and the rest of his life, and did not breathe. The child looked back at him with the focused, grave attention of a baby who found the world genuinely interesting, and then closed his eyes again and went back to sleep. Snape stood up. He went back across the street. He stood in the shadow of the privet hedge and did not think about anything at all for quite a long time. The light came on at 5:30. He heard them before he saw anything, the sounds of a household morning, kettle, radio at low volume, the thud of heavy feet on stairs. The kitchen light blazed on and Vernon Dursley appeared in his dressing gown, and then Petunia Dursley appeared, and Snape watched her stop in the kitchen doorway the way people stop when they've just remembered something unpleasant they'd been hoping had been a dream. She went to the front door. She opened it. She looked down. For a moment, she just stood there, and Snape watched something move across her face that he couldn't quite name. It was complex and fast, grief and fury and fear and something else flickering through in under 3 seconds before her expression closed like a fist. She picked up the basket. She stepped back inside. She closed the door. Snape stayed. He extended his senses the way Dumbledore had taught him, the careful legilimency-adjacent awareness that wasn't quite reading minds but was something close, more like reading the emotional weather of a space, the residue of feeling that clung to places and people. He'd been exceptionally good at it since he was 14 and had discovered that knowing what people were feeling before they said it was the only reliable advantage available to someone of his particular background and disposition. What he felt from inside number 4 Privet Drive was not warmth. It was not the complicated but fundamentally loving turbulence of a household dealing with unexpected grief. It was something flatter. Something with a cold core to it, the emotional temperature of a house where love was rationed and the rationing had been going on long enough that everyone inside had stopped noticing. He heard voices, muffled through the walls. Vernon's was too low to parse. Petunia's came through once, sharp and clear, saying I told him years ago, I said we didn't want anything to do with, before dropping back below audibility. He heard the baby cry. Not the preliminary sound from the night before, but properly, the sustained cry of an infant who was cold and hungry and in a strange place and wanted someone to acknowledge these facts. The cry went on for 3 minutes. Snape counted. Then he heard a door close somewhere in the house, not the crying stopping, just a door between the crying and the rest of the house being shut, and the radio got slightly louder, and Vernon Dursley appeared in the kitchen window again, eating toast, looking at the back garden with the expression of a man thinking about his day. Snape pulled out his wand. He was very controlled about it. He'd been controlling himself all night, through the cold and the watching and the moment with those green eyes, and he was still controlling himself now, standing in the thin grey early morning with the wand in his hand, because losing control would not help. Losing control would get him killed, or arrested, or expelled from the position he needed to occupy to do the work Dumbledore wanted him to do. He understood the strategic value of calm. He was also, he acknowledged privately, absolutely incandescent. The memory charm he used was his own modification of a standard design. It didn't take the memory, it copied it, leaving the original intact in his own mind while creating an external record that could be stored, transferred, viewed. He developed it during the war for purposes he didn't want to think about right now. He cast it across the house systematically, drawing out every relevant moment of the past 6 hours, the light going on at 11:43, Vernon's face at the kitchen window, Petunia's expression when she opened the door, the voice saying I told him I said we didn't want anything, the baby crying for 3 minutes while the radio got louder. He was precise. He was thorough. He worked with the methodical focus of a man who has found a task and is grateful for the task because the task is the only thing currently standing between him and doing something irreversible. When he was done, he had a small glass vial of silvery liquid memory, stoppered and sealed. He held it up in the early morning light and looked at it for a moment. It caught the pale gray of the sky and shimmered with it. He put it in his coat pocket. He stood there for another moment, and then he did something he had not planned to do and would not have predicted, which was that he crossed the street one more time, walked up the front path of number 4 Privet Drive, and stood at the door. He didn't knock. He bent down, the basket was still there, he noticed, they'd brought the child in but left the basket, which was a detail that recorded itself in him with horrible clarity, and he pressed one hand flat to the wooden step and cast a ward. Not Dumbledore's ward, not the blood protection that the old man had anchored to this house with his careful webs of magic. Something simpler. Something that would tell Snape if the child inside was in immediate physical danger. It wasn't a solution. He knew it wasn't a solution. He was buying himself 24 hours, maybe 48, to find an actual one. He stood up, took his hand off the step, and apparat away. He didn't go back to Spinner's End. He went to Diagon Alley, to the small potion supply shop on a side street near the leaky cauldron that kept peculiar hours and whose proprietor had learned over many years not to ask Severus Snape what he needed things for. He bought 2 more vials. He was already composing the letter in his head. The question was who? Not Dumbledore. He had dismissed this before he'd even framed the question properly. He understood Dumbledore's thinking, he'd been living inside it for years, the long game, the necessary sacrifice, the individual suffering weighed against the collective good, and he understood it well enough to know that if he brought these memories to Dumbledore, Dumbledore would look at them and say something careful about blood protection and the necessity of Lily's sacrifice and the importance of the boy growing up without knowing his own significance, and the child would go back to that house. The memories might trouble him. They would not stop him. Dumbledore's relationship with the troubling of his own conscience was long and practiced and had produced no observable change in behavior in all the years Snape had known him. Not the Ministry. Not the Ministry as an institution, at least. The Ministry was a leaking sieve of political allegiance, still convulsing through the aftermath of the war, and anything he fed into it at the wrong point would come out Dumbledore's desk or someone worse. He needed a person, not a department. He was in the small potions shop writing the letter when the name arrived, with the finality of something that had been obvious all along. Amelia Bones. He knew her by reputation, which was considerable, and by one brief meeting at a Death Eater gathering 3 years ago where she'd been pointed out to him as a target of interest, someone the Dark Lord wanted to bring in or eliminate, a woman making herself inconvenient through the sheer bloody-minded application of legal process to people who considered themselves above it. He'd heard her described variously as incorruptible, relentless, and, this from Lucius Malfoy, with the particular loathing of a man who found having principles in others deeply offensive, irritatingly principled. She was head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. She had jurisdiction. She had integrity. And she had, as far as Snape could determine, no particular relationship with Dumbledore that would override her willingness to act on evidence. He wrote carefully. He did not sign it. He explained what he was sending, where it came from, and what it showed, with the precision of a potions master writing instructions, complete, unambiguous, leaving no room for misinterpretation. He explained the child's location, the protections on the house, the timeline. He explained that the child had been crying for 3 minutes while the household went about its morning and a door had been closed between the sound and the rest of the family. He did not write about Lily. He did not write about why he'd been there, or why he cared, or what it had felt like to see those eyes open in the dark. None of that was relevant. None of that would help Harry Potter. He addressed the letter to Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, personal correspondence only. He wrapped the memory vials in cloth, packed them in a small wooden box, sealed it with spells she would need to be specifically Amelia Bones to open. He'd found a charm in a book once, keyed to individual magical signature, the kind of thing that only worked if you'd encountered the person's magic directly. He'd encountered hers at that gathering, briefly, when she'd been pointed out to him as a target and he'd automatically catalogued her signature the way he catalogued everything. He had not, at the time, imagined finding a use for it. He found he was grateful now for his own reflexive thoroughness. He sealed the box. He paid for his vials without speaking. He went out into the early morning of Diagon Alley, which was just beginning to stir with people still drunk on celebration, still wearing their party hats and their magical fireworks, still toasting each other outside the leaky cauldron with butterbeers and expressions of overwhelming relief. He walked through them without stopping. Someone called out something about you-know-who and he didn't turn. Someone else tried to grab his arm in the manner of a person who wanted to share their joy with a stranger and he looked at them once and they let go. He found an owl post office that was open, it was Diagon Alley, something was always open, and he sent the package. He paid for the fastest service, the guaranteed personal delivery, the receipt confirmation. He paid in cash. He did not give his name. He walked out of the post office and stood on the street, and the celebration went on around him, and he put both hands in his coat pockets and felt the empty space where the vial had been. Done. He stood there long enough that the sky went from gray to pale gold, the early winter sunrise washing cold light across the uneven rooftops of the alley. Someone nearby was crying with relief. Someone else was singing. A child was sitting on her father's shoulders, laughing at something Snape couldn't see, and the father had both hands wrapped around the child's ankles to keep her steady, and wasn't looking at anything but her. Snape turned and walked away. He went back to Spinner's End, because there was nowhere else to go. The house was cold when he arrived, the fire long dead, and he didn't relight it. He sat in the chair by the empty grate and looked at the ash of Dumbledore's letter, which had shifted in the draft from the door but otherwise remained exactly where he'd left it, and he thought about what he'd done. He hadn't saved the boy. He'd sent evidence to a woman he'd met once, across a room, at a gathering of people who wanted her dead. He'd sent it anonymously. He didn't know if she'd act on it, or when, or what would happen if she did. He'd put the most famous child in the wizarding world's fate in the hands of a stranger, and he'd done it because the alternative was leaving it in the hands of a man he trusted less. He understood that this could go wrong in several different ways. He also understood, and this was the part he kept coming back to, sitting in the cold and the gray morning light, that it was the only thing he'd done in recent memory that had come from somewhere clean. Not from fear, not from obligation, not from the complicated debt and loyalty structure that had been the operating system of his life for years. He'd done it because a child had been left on a cold step and a door had been closed against its crying, and some part of him that had survived everything, the Dursleys of his own childhood, the war, Lily, had said no. Not this. Not this too. He pulled his coat tighter and closed his eyes. At some point he slept. He didn't dream, or if he did, he didn't remember it, which amounted to the same thing. When he woke, the room was fully dark, the November afternoon already gone, and he sat very still for a moment trying to locate himself in time. There was a sound, and then he recognized it, the ward he'd placed on the step at Privet Drive, activated. His hand was on his wand before he was fully upright. Then the ward signal completed itself, not danger, he'd keyed it to immediate physical danger, and this wasn't that, this was distress, which was different, which was the smaller alert, which meant, he sat back down. Which meant the child was crying again, or cold, or frightened, or unhappy in any of the ordinary ways a baby could be unhappy, and he'd built the ward to tell him if that reached a threshold, and apparently it had. He sat in the dark and felt the small pull of the ward against his magic and did not move. He had sent the memories. He had done what he could do. He was not Harry Potter's guardian or his godfather or his family or anything to him at all, and going back to Privet Drive tonight would accomplish nothing except potentially drawing attention to a situation that needed, right now, to run its course through the proper channels without interference. He sat in the dark. The ward pulsed once more and went quiet, not because the situation had resolved, he didn't think, but because whatever threshold he'd set had dropped back below the line. He sat in the quiet of Spinner's End and listened to the distant sound of someone celebrating in a street somewhere, a very late holdout, still singing at whatever hour this was. He did not go back. He told himself, clearly and without sentiment, that he would not go back. That he had done the thing available to him and that doing more would compromise everything. That Dumbledore could not know he'd been there. That this needed to stay exactly what it was, an anonymous package from an unknown sender, a set of memories landing on the right desk, the law doing what the law was theoretically for. He allowed himself one thing, which was the thought that somewhere across the city, or wherever Amelia Bones lived, a wooden box was sitting on a desk or a mat or a table, waiting to be opened. That in the morning, or whenever she collected her post, she would open it and break the seal, which meant her magic would touch it, which meant it would open for her and no one else, and she would see. That was enough. It had to be enough. He'd made his choice and it was done, and now he had to live with the consequences of it, whatever those turned out to be, without being able to control or even observe them. He was very bad at that. He knew he was very bad at that. But the alternative was being the kind of person who saw what he'd seen and did nothing, and that was something he'd already tried, and it had resulted in Lily Evans dying in her own home, and he was not doing it again. He got up. He went to the kitchen. He made tea, because he was British and because it was something to do with his hands, and he stood at the kitchen window and drank it in the dark, looking out at the back street where he and Lily had played as children, where he'd first shown her what magic was, where he'd told her about Hogwarts and watched her face light up with the particular joy of someone discovering that the world was larger than they'd thought. The street was empty. Of course it was. It had been empty for years. He drank his tea. He thought about the letter he'd written. Whether he'd been precise enough, clear enough, whether there was any ambiguity that Bones might resolve in the wrong direction or that someone else might exploit. He ran through it methodically, the way he'd check a potion, every ingredient, every step, looking for the place where something might go wrong. He didn't find one. He'd been careful. He was always careful, it was both his best quality and the one that had cost him the most, and this time he thought the carefulness had served rather than betrayed him. He washed the cup. He dried it. He put it away. He went upstairs and lay down on the bed with his coat still on, because the house was cold and lighting fires felt like too much commitment to being here, being present, being this version of himself in this moment. He stared at the ceiling. He thought, with the precise unwilling clarity of exhaustion, that he had now done two things in his life from that clean place, the place without debt or fear or the grinding machinery of obligation. The first had been going to Dumbledore and begging for Lily's life, and that had failed. This was the second, and he didn't know yet whether it would fail. He thought that Lily would have been angry with him for a lot of things. She'd have been angry about the dark mark on his arm, about the years before it, about the word he'd called her in 5th year that he couldn't undo no matter how many times he unspooled the memory and tried to find a different ending. She'd have been angry about his choices and the people he'd made them with and the time he'd wasted and the cruelty he'd participated in. He thought she wouldn't have been angry about tonight. That was something. It wasn't enough. It was something. He closed his eyes. The ward on the step at Privet Drive was quiet. Outside, finally, the last celebration had gone silent, the city folded into its ordinary night, the extraordinary day becoming just a day. Severus Snape lay in the dark and waited, without knowing he was waiting, for the rest of his life to begin. Down the street, Lily Evans had once found a beetle and made it dance, laughing, 7 years old and already magnificent, and he'd watched her with the absolute certainty of a child who understood very early that some people contain more light than the space they inhabit can reasonably hold, and that the best you can do is stay close and hope some of it reaches you. He had not stayed close enough. He had not been what she needed. He had been, in the final accounting, insufficient as a friend, insufficient as a person, insufficient at the critical moment when being sufficient was the only thing that mattered. But Harry Potter was alive and on a step in Surrey rather than dead in a house in Godric's Hollow, and somewhere in Wizarding London a box was sitting on a desk, and inside it was everything the wizarding world needed to see. It's not enough, he thought. It's not nearly enough. But it's what there is. He slept. Chapter 2, The Woman Who Read the Letter. The box arrived on a Tuesday. Amelia Bones knew it was Tuesday because she'd been in the office since Sunday and the days had started bleeding together the way they always did in the immediate aftermath of something enormous, and the fall of Voldemort was, by any reasonable measure, the most enormous thing that had happened in her lifetime. Her desk was buried. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement had spent the past 48 hours processing a volume of cases that would normally represent 3 months of work: Death Eaters turning themselves in, Death Eaters being turned in by their neighbors, Death Eaters claiming to have been imperiused, celebrations that had turned into property damage, celebrations that had turned into worse things, and the particular administrative nightmare of a war ending suddenly with no formal structure for what came next. She'd slept on her office couch for 4 hours Sunday night and 3 hours Monday night, and she was currently on her second pot of tea and her 4th set of case files when her assistant knocked and said there was a personal package in the Morning Post that had the most unusual sealing charm he'd ever encountered. "Unusual how?" she said, without looking up. "It won't open, ma'am." "I tried the standard. Did I ask you to open my personal correspondence?" A pause. "No, ma'am." "Then put it on my desk and get back to the Mulciber affidavit." The box was small, she could cover it with both hands, wrapped in plain brown cloth and sealed with what turned out, when she examined it, to be an extremely sophisticated personal signature lock. She'd encountered this class of charm exactly twice before, both times in high-security ministry contexts, and it had no business being on someone's personal post. She touched it and felt her own magic answer the seal, and the cloth fell away. Inside, a letter, and 2 vials of silvery memory. She read the letter standing up, because she'd been sitting for 16 hours and her back was telling her about it. She read it once quickly and then she read it again slowly, and then she sat down after all, because some things required sitting. The letter had no signature. It had no identifying information of any kind that she could immediately find, and she was good at finding that sort of thing. It was essentially her profession. What it had was precision. An address. A timeline. A description of events with the particularity of a witness account given by someone with an excellent memory and a habit of noting details. The writing itself was controlled, spare, almost clinical, but underneath the clinical surface was something she recognized from years of reading statements from people who'd seen terrible things and were trying to report them accurately, the contained pressure of genuine feeling being kept carefully out of the way of the facts. Whoever had written this was furious. They were writing as though fury was a luxury they couldn't afford, so they'd locked it in a box somewhere and were writing from outside it, but she could feel the box. She read it a 3rd time. Harry Potter was alive. She knew that, the whole world knew that, it was the defining fact of the past 72 hours. What she had not known, what apparently no one in any official capacity had seen fit to make known, was where the boy was, and with whom. She'd assumed Dumbledore had arrangements. She'd assumed, and she recognized now the particular quality of this assumption, the way it relied on Dumbledore's reputation rather than any actual knowledge. She'd assumed those arrangements were appropriate. She picked up the first memory vial. She kept a pensieve in the cabinet behind her desk. It was a practical tool in her line of work, not a luxury, and she tipped the memory in and bent over it and went in. What she saw was Privet Drive at night. The basket. The blanket. The letter under the corner of the blanket in Dumbledore's hand. She recognized his handwriting. She'd seen enough official correspondence. She watched the light come on at 11:43. She watched Vernon Dursley drink his glass of water and go back to bed. She watched Petunia Dursley open the front door in the morning and look down, and she watched every one of those 3 seconds of complex emotion cross the woman's face, and she watched the expression close. She heard the door shut between the crying and the house. She heard the radio get louder. She came out of the memory and stood very still for a moment, looking at the wall of her office with its pinned maps and case notes and the photograph of her brother Edgar that she kept on the corner of the desk, because Edgar had died in this war and she kept his photograph there as a reminder that the work was not abstract. She picked up the second vial. This one was shorter. Just the crying. 3 minutes and 14 seconds of an infant crying in an empty room, measured against the muffled sound of a radio playing elsewhere in the house. That was all. But 3 minutes and 14 seconds, when you were standing inside them, was a very long time. She came out of the second memory and immediately called for her assistant. Williamson. The Dursley residence, I need the Muggle records. Property, family structure, employment, everything available through the liaison office. I need it in an hour. He blinked. The liaison office with the Muggle government was not something most DMLE staff had ever used. The Muggle, an hour, Williamson. Yes, ma'am. She sat down and pressed her hands flat on the desk and thought. Dumbledore had left Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the child who had somehow survived the killing curse and destroyed the most dangerous dark wizard in a century, with Muggles, which was not in itself objectionable. What was objectionable was the specific Muggles, who had by all visible evidence received an infant placed on their doorstep like an abandoned parcel and responded by shutting a door between it and themselves. She also thought about the fact that Dumbledore had done this without informing her department. Without informing anyone, apparently, in any official capacity. The most famous child in the wizarding world was living, presumably, at a Muggle address in Surrey under no protective oversight she could identify, based on decisions made by one man who had not consulted anyone and had not filed so much as a notification. She pulled a fresh piece of parchment toward her and began making notes, because notes were how she thought and thinking was what this required. The legal ground was reasonably clear. The magical world had child welfare statutes. They were not well used, not well enforced, chronically underfunded, and most of the department treated them as a minor administrative function rather than a serious area of law. She'd been trying to change that for years with limited success. But the statutes existed, and what she'd seen in those memories met the threshold with room to spare. Abandonment. Willful neglect. A child in demonstrable distress with no adult intervention. The complication was Dumbledore. She wasn't afraid of Dumbledore, she wanted to be clear with herself about that. She respected him. She'd relied on him during the war. She also knew, with the clarity of someone who had watched him operate for 20 years, that he considered the law a useful tool when it aligned with his vision of events and an inconvenience to be managed when it didn't. He was not corrupt in any ordinary sense. He was something more specifically dangerous, which was a person of genuine good intentions who had decided that his judgment was more reliable than any external check on it. If she moved on this openly, he would fight her. He would fight her with the full weight of his reputation and his political relationships and his particular gift for making people feel that opposing him was not just mistaken but slightly foolish. She was not afraid of that either. But she was a lawyer, in spirit if not formal training, and she had not got to where she was by being imprecise. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it in a way that couldn't be unpicked. Williamson appeared in an hour with the Muggle records, as directed, and she read them thoroughly and added several things to her notes, and then she spent the rest of Tuesday and all of Tuesday night building the case. She was systematic. She took the memories and had them formally certified by the Department of Mysteries. This was a service they offered, the magical equivalent of evidence authentication, and it meant the memories could not be challenged as fabricated or altered. She applied for the certification through the quietest available channel, describing the evidence as relating to an open child welfare inquiry, which was technically true. She pulled the relevant statutes. She found 3 case precedents, 2 of them obscure enough that she suspected she was one of very few people at the ministry who'd ever read them. She drafted the intervention order, then drafted it again when she found a cleaner legal basis, then drafted it a 3rd time with language tight enough that she could not see a way to challenge it that didn't require directly contradicting statute. She did not tell anyone what she was doing or why. On Wednesday morning she went to the Wisengamot clerk's office before it opened, waited outside in the corridor with her paperwork, and filed the intervention order the moment the door unlocked. Because being first in the filing queue meant being first on the docket, and being first on the docket meant she had the order in hand before the working day properly began and before anyone with an interest in the matter had a chance to know it was happening. The clerk, a young man named Tobias who had been in the job for 2 years and had never seen the head of the DMLE standing outside the office at 7:45 in the morning, said, is there something, process it, Tobias. Yes, ma'am. Right away. She had the signed order in her pocket by 8:15. She went back to her office and sent 3 owls, one to her most trusted field officer, one to a healer at St. Mungo's who did child welfare assessments and owed her a favor, and one to a witch named Hestia Jones who worked in magical child placement and had, in Amelia's assessment, the rare combination of genuine competence and absolute discretion. Then she wrote a letter to Dumbledore. It was not an aggressive letter. It was not a challenging letter. It said that she had received information relating to the welfare of Harry Potter, that she had opened a formal inquiry, and that she would be in touch in due course. It was the administrative equivalent of a polite nod across a room from someone who is about to do something you're not going to enjoy. She sent it and put it out of her mind, because she had an intervention to execute. The team assembled at the apparition point outside Little Whinging at 9 in the morning. Dawlish, the field officer, was good in a crisis and bad at paperwork, which made him exactly right for today. The healer was a calm woman named Patchett who carried her assessment kit with the manner of someone who'd done this before and found it consistently necessary. Hestia Jones arrived in Muggle clothes and immediately looked more comfortable in them than either of the others, which was professionally helpful on a Muggle street in Surrey. They walked up Privet Drive at 9:15. Amelia had been in difficult situations involving magic and violence and the genuine threat of death, and none of them had produced quite the particular quality of tension she felt walking down this street. It was so aggressively ordinary. It was the kind of street that had never been touched by anything, that had been designed from the ground up to be untouchable, and there was something almost obscene about what she knew was inside one of these houses. She knocked on the door of number 4. Vernon Dursley opened it in his work clothes. He'd been about to leave for the day, she gathered, briefcase in the hallway, and looked at the 4 people on his step with the expression of a man whose day had already contained one unpleasant surprise and was deeply unenthused about a second. "Mr. Dursley," Amelia said. "My name is Amelia Bones. I'm the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. May we come in?" She watched him decide in real time whether to claim not to know what she was talking about. She watched him look at Dawlish, who was large and had the patient stillness of a man who was very good at his job, and then at the document in her hand, and then at her face. "I suppose you'd better," he said. The house was neat to the point of sterility. Everything in its place, everything coordinated, a home that had been decorated with considerable effort and money and no particular joy. Petunia Dursley appeared from the kitchen, and her face, when she saw Amelia, went white in a way that was not the whiteness of surprise but the whiteness of something confirmed. She'd been expecting this. Not today, not necessarily, but this, someone showing up. She'd been waiting for it. "Mrs. Dursley," Amelia said. "We're here about Harry Potter." "He's perfectly fine," Petunia said, immediately, reflexively. He's upstairs. He's fine. Dr. Patchett will need to examine him." "He's fine, I've just said, Dr. Patchett will need to examine him," Amelia said again, in exactly the same tone, and waited. Petunia's mouth thinned. She looked at Vernon. Vernon looked at the document in Amelia's hand again, and his mustache moved in a way that suggested extensive and unhelpful things were happening behind it. Patchett went upstairs. Amelia sat down in the Dursleys' living room without being invited, because she had a signed intervention order and she wasn't visiting socially. Hestia stayed near the door. Dawlish stood in the hallway and simply existed, which he was excellent at. We were going to give him a proper room," Vernon said, which was interesting because no one had yet mentioned a room. "We were sorting it out. It's been 2 days, we've barely had time to, Mr. Dursley," Amelia said. "I'd recommend not explaining things I haven't asked about." Silence. Patchett came downstairs after about 10 minutes. The expression on her face was professional and controlled and told Amelia everything she needed to know before a word was spoken. "Healthy," Patchett said carefully. "He's healthy. He's been fed and he's warm now. There are no injuries." She paused. "He was in a room with the door closed. I could hear him from the hallway before I opened it." "He cried," Petunia said, the defensive sharpness of someone who'd been expecting judgment. "Babies cry. I have a son of my own, I know about babies, and sometimes you have to let them." "For how long?" Amelia asked. "I beg your pardon? How long do you let him cry?" The silence this time had a different quality. Petunia's jaw moved. Vernon looked at his briefcase in the hallway with the intense focus of a man wishing he were at work. Amelia let the silence run. "We'll be taking Harry," she said, when enough of it had passed. "Dr. Patchett will accompany him to a medical facility for a full assessment, and Ms. Jones will begin the placement process. You'll receive written notification of the formal proceedings." "You can't just," Vernon started. "The intervention order," Amelia said, placing it on the coffee table, "is signed by 3 members of the Wisengamot and carries the full authority of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement under Statute 47 of the Child Welfare Act of 1958, which was amended in 1973 to extend jurisdiction to magical children in mixed heritage households." "I can, Mr. Dursley. I just did." Petunia hadn't moved. She was looking at the order on the table, not at Amelia, and her face had gone through several more expressions in rapid succession. There was something in it now that Amelia hadn't expected, which was something like relief. It was there for only a moment and then it was gone, buried back under the stiff defensive propriety, but Amelia had seen it. She filed it away and said nothing about it. Hestia brought Harry downstairs. He was small, they were always smaller than you expected, Amelia thought, and he was awake, looking around with the attentive, serious expression of a baby who found the world genuinely interesting. He had dark hair going in multiple directions and his eyes were, she noticed this, because the eyes were what everyone was talking about in every celebration she'd walked through in the past 2 days, he had his mother's eyes. She'd known Lily Potter slightly. Not well, but enough. Those were Lily's eyes exactly, looking out from James's face, and the combination of it made something tighten briefly in her chest. Hestia had him settled against her shoulder with the ease of someone who'd done this many times. Harry regarded Amelia with frank interest, grabbed at the air near her lapel pin, and made a sound of mild frustration when he couldn't reach it. Amelia looked at him for a moment. "Hello," she said. Harry looked at her. His expression seemed, in the way that babies' expressions seem things without necessarily meaning them, entirely composed. Considering. "We're going to sort you out," she said, which was both true and insufficient, but he was 15 months old and she thought it was what was available. She picked up the intervention order from the coffee table. She did not look at the Dursleys when she left. Outside on the street, she breathed the November air and watched Patchett and Hestia get into the nondescript ministry car, Muggle style, another practical measure, dollish at the wheel, and felt, underneath the professional calm, something she could only describe as very tired and very angry in equal measure. She wasn't angry at the Dursleys, particularly. They were small, frightened, ordinary people who had been handed an extraordinary situation they'd never wanted and had responded to it with cruelty, which was depressingly common. She was angry at the structure that had made it possible. The casual assumption that one person's good intentions were sufficient protection. The decision made by one man in the dark of the night, without consultation, that this was fine. She walked back to the apparition point and went to work. The response from Dumbledore arrived that afternoon. She'd expected it. She'd expected it to be carefully worded and warm and faintly patronizing in the way that only someone of Dumbledore's particular skill could manage while maintaining plausible deniability of condescension, and it was all of those things. It expressed concern about the interruption of certain protective enchantments. It suggested a meeting at her earliest convenience. It referred to the larger strategic picture, twice, which was Dumbledore's way of implying that she was missing something important without specifying what. It closed with, "I'm sure we both want what's best for Harry," in a way that managed to suggest she might not. She read it once and put it in the case file. The protective enchantments were a genuine issue. She'd known they would be. She'd consulted the Department of Mysteries before she filed the order, specifically about the blood protection magic Dumbledore had anchored to the Dursley household, and their answer had been that the magic was real and significant and anchored to Petunia Dursley as Lily Potter's remaining blood relative. Removing Harry from that anchor was not without magical consequence. She'd looked at that and she'd looked at the memories of a door being closed against 3 minutes and 14 seconds of crying, and she'd made her decision, and she was at peace with it. Magical protections could be rebuilt, redesigned, re-anchored. What happened to a child in their earliest years, the baseline of what they understood the world to be, whether they were answered or ignored, whether distress brought comfort or silence, that built differently. That was harder to undo. She sent for the Department of Mysteries consultant and spent the afternoon in a conference with him and Patchett about Harry's magical status and the options available for maintaining some version of the protective intent without requiring the child to live in a house where he was not wanted. It was, as it turned out, solvable. Not immediately and not simply, but solvable. The Mysteries consultant said so with the qualified confidence of someone who spent most of their professional life in the proximity of things that were theoretically impossible and had developed a healthy respect for what was actually impossible versus what was just difficult. She told him to get started. The placement question was moving in parallel. Hestia had a list of vetted magical families, people who'd been assessed and cleared and expressed willingness to take children on short or long-term bases. She went through it with Amelia that evening, short-term options first, for the immediate period while the full picture was developed, and they talked through each one with the specific attention of women who took this seriously. There was a family in Edinburgh, a retired Auror and her husband, both known personally to Amelia, who had taken in 2 children during the war and both times done it exceptionally well. They were contacted that evening. They said yes before Hestia had finished explaining the situation. Harry Potter went to Edinburgh on the evening of November 5, 1981, 4 days after being left on a doorstep in Surrey, and the retired Auror, Margaret Calloway, small and fierce and with the kind of warmth that was practical rather than performative, met them at the door and took him from Hestia's arms with the complete confidence of someone who had done this before and knew exactly what she was doing. Harry looked at her. Margaret said, "Hello, you," and shifted him onto her hip like she'd been carrying him for years. Harry grabbed a fistful of her grey hair. Margaret said, "Ow," mildly and didn't try to stop him. Hestia operated back and told Amelia about it, and Amelia, alone in her office at 9 in the evening with the case file spread across her desk and 3 empty teacups and the photograph of her brother on the corner of the desk, allowed herself to feel, for approximately 30 seconds, the relief of a thing going right. Then she picked up the file and kept working. Dumbledore came to see her on Thursday. She had expected this too, had expected him in person, rather than by letter, because the letter hadn't produced results and Dumbledore preferred the personal approach when management was required. He appeared in her doorway at 11 in the morning, and she noted the timing, late enough to seem unrushed, early enough to claim urgency, an old negotiator's trick that she found she was mildly amused by. "Amelia," he said. He was wearing robes that were either dark blue or black depending on the light, and his half-moon spectacles were slightly askew, which she'd always suspected was a deliberate choice. He sat down across from her desk in a way that managed to seem comfortable in her space without being aggressive about it. A masterclass in confident informality. "Albus," she said. She did not offer him tea. "I find myself in the slightly awkward position," he said, with the rueful smile of a man who considered awkward positions beneath him but was willing to perform them when necessary, of not quite understanding how this has happened. "Which part of it?" "Harry has been removed from his aunt and uncle's home." "Yes. On the basis of compelling evidence of neglect. I have a formally certified set of memories from a witness, a physical assessment by a qualified healer, and a signed intervention order from the Wiesengamat." She paused. "It's quite thorough." Dumbledore looked at her with the steady attention he was famous for, the kind that made people feel he was looking through them rather than at them. She'd always found it less affecting than most people seemed to. She looked back. "The blood protection," he said. "Lily's sacrifice, is being looked at by the Department of Mysteries with a view to determining whether the magical intent can be maintained in a different structural form. They're cautiously optimistic." She kept her voice even. "I wouldn't have moved Harry if I didn't have a path forward on the protective magic. You know me better than that." A pause. "The witness memories," Dumbledore said. "May I ask their origin?" "No." Something shifted, very slightly, in his expression. "I see. I have an obligation to protect the identity of witnesses who file evidence in confidence. You know that too." "Of course." He was quiet for a moment. In the silence, she could almost hear him recalibrating. "Amelia. I want to be very clear that my concern is entirely for Harry's well-being. The protections I put in place were not, as far as I can establish, discussed with anyone in this department, or with the Wiesengamat, or with any child welfare authority, or indeed with anyone at all beyond yourself." She kept her voice pleasant. "A decision of that magnitude, concerning the most significant child in Wizarding Britain, was made unilaterally in the middle of the night and implemented without oversight." Dumbledore held her gaze. He was not a man who looked away under pressure, which she respected, even now. "In extraordinary circumstances, we make decisions that we then have to justify." She opened the case file. "I'm not bringing charges, Albus. I want to be clear about that. What happened on the 1st of November is not, legally, something I can bring charges over, even if I wanted to. What I am doing is establishing a formal framework for Harry Potter's upbringing that involves proper oversight, proper assessment, and proper placement." She looked at him directly. "It will not be undone. I want you to hear me say that clearly." A long silence. Outside her office, the sounds of the department carried on, owls, footsteps, someone 2 doors down arguing about a filing classification. "He'll need to be protected," Dumbledore said finally. "Tom may be gone, but gone is not the same as finished. There are those who would, yes. Which is why I'm handling this through a framework that can provide actual protection with actual oversight, rather than a single pair of hands, however capable." She closed the file. "I'm not your enemy, Albus. I want what you want. I want Harry Potter to be safe and well and to grow up to be whoever he's going to be." She paused one beat. "I simply disagree about the method." Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something in his expression that she might have called, in a less controlled man, genuine uncertainty. It was there briefly, and then the warmth returned, the careful considered warmth that was his primary instrument. "I hope you're right," he said. "So do I," she said. "Was there anything else?" He left. He was gracious about it, which she'd expected, and he did not make any of the several moves available to him that might have complicated her position, which she noted. He was calculating something, reconsidering something, fitting this new piece into his picture of the world. That was fine. He could calculate. The order was filed and the child was in Edinburgh and the Department of Mysteries was working on the blood protection and Dumbledore had not found a lever he could move. She wrote a brief note, updated her case file, and then did something she'd been doing at the end of each day since Sunday, which was to add to a sealed record she was keeping separately from the main file. Not for the Ministry. Not for anyone, currently. Just a record, everything she'd done and when and why, a documented chain of decision-making that existed outside the official channels where decisions could be revised or lost or quietly redescribed. Something told her she might need it. Something told her this was not finished. She was right about that. She was right about most things eventually, which was the quality she valued most in herself and found most exhausting. The Calloways sent a short note from Edinburgh on Friday. Harry was well. He'd eaten an enormous amount of porridge at breakfast, apparently, with the enthusiasm of a baby who discovered he quite liked porridge and felt strongly that people should know about it. He was sleeping in a room that was warm and not behind a closed door, and Margaret Calloway, who had raised 2 children of her own and helped with several others, said he was responding well. He'd laughed that morning, the note said. At the ceiling light fixture of all things, which Margaret's husband had been fiddling with when Harry noticed it, and something about the light or the movement or the general situation of ceiling light fixtures had struck the boy as genuinely hilarious. Amelia put the note in the case file and then took it out of the case file and put it in the drawer of her desk instead. That evening, before she left the office, at a reasonable hour for the first time since Sunday, because eventually even she had to sleep, she looked at her brother Edgar's photograph and thought about the anonymous letter. About the precision of it, and the rage underneath the precision, and the seal keyed to her magical signature so specifically that whoever had sent it had encountered her magic in person. She didn't know who had sent it. She had some guesses that she hadn't yet examined carefully, because guessing about the identity of a witness was not something she was going to let herself do before she had actual evidence. What she knew was that whoever it was had taken a significant risk. They'd had access to private property. They'd used a sophisticated memory charm. They'd had enough knowledge of ministry structure to know she was the right person to contact, enough knowledge of her specifically to key the seal to her signature, and enough sense to stay out of it after sending it rather than pushing for follow-up or credit. That last part was the one that stayed with her. Whoever had done this didn't want to be known. They'd done it anyway. They'd done it well, and anonymously, and then they'd stepped back. She thought that took a particular kind of courage that didn't get talked about much, the courage of the action without the vindication. Doing the thing and walking away from the consequences without any assurance of the outcome. She hoped, wherever they were, they knew it had worked. She turned off the office light. She walked out into the corridor, nodded to the night staff, took the lift down, walked out into the cold November air of wizarding London and opera home. In Edinburgh, in a warm room with a properly functioning ceiling light, Harry Potter slept. Chapter 3. The boy who arrived 10 years was a long time to wait for something, and Severus Snape had spent most of it not thinking about it. That was what he told himself, anyway. The truth was more specific. He thought about it precisely once a year, on the 1st of November, when he would sit in his office at Hogwarts with a glass of something strong and allow himself exactly 1 hour of thinking about the choice he'd made in the grey early morning of a Surrey street, and then he would put it away for another year. He'd made this system in year 3 and it had worked reasonably well, which meant he thought about it constantly in the week leading up to November 1st and barely at all after it, which was close enough to not thinking about it that he counted it. He knew the boy was in Edinburgh. He'd learned that from a carefully worded notice in the Daily Prophet 8 days after November 1st, a terse ministry announcement buried on page 12 that referenced the appropriate placement of the child known as Harry Potter with a vetted wizarding family pending formal guardianship proceedings. He'd read it 4 times, standing in his kitchen, and then he'd made breakfast with the composed efficiency of a man who had received exactly the news he'd hoped for and was going to be mature about it. He'd been very mature about it for 10 years. He'd heard things, in the way you heard things when you moved in the circles he moved in, scraps and rumors, nothing substantial. The Calloway family. Edinburgh. The boy was healthy, apparently thriving, apparently being educated both magically and otherwise. He'd heard this through 2 different channels and both times had not asked a follow-up question, because follow-up questions were for people who were involved in the situation, and he was not involved. He was a potions professor and a spy and a man who had made one decision 10 years ago and had done an excellent job of not making the situation personal. He thought about this while he watched the new first years file into the Great Hall on the 1st of September, 1991. The sorting always struck him as a slightly brutal ritual, placing children in their permanent social category at 11 years old, before most of them knew who they were, was efficient in the way that most magic was efficient, which was to say it got the thing done without particularly caring about the human texture of the process. He watched them come in and performed the automatic assessment he always performed, looking at faces and posture and the particular combination of fear and excitement that every first year carried in varying proportions. He found Harry Potter in the line almost immediately. He recognized him the way you recognized something you'd been bracing for, not surprised, but rearranged. The boy was small for 11, which Snape filed away with clinical detachment, and he had James Potter's chaotic dark hair, but he moved through the hall with a quality that stopped Snape from immediately cataloging him as James Potter's son the way he'd been half expecting to. He was looking around the Great Hall the way a person looked at something genuinely interesting, not with the reflexive performance of wonder but with actual attention, his eyes moving across the enchanted ceiling and the floating candles and the mass of assembled students with the expression of someone building a mental map. He was also, Snape noticed with the unwilling precision of someone who couldn't help noticing things, wearing his robes correctly, walking with his head up, and talking easily with the red-headed boy next to him, Weasley, a 6th Weasley. Snape had been teaching Weasleys for longer than he wanted to contemplate, in the relaxed manner of someone who'd made the friend recently and was comfortable with him already. Not damaged. That was what Snape was actually clocking, underneath all the surface detail. Not the particular quality of a child who'd been hurt and healed to various degrees of success. Just present. In himself. Snape looked at the ceiling. When they called Potter, Harry, the hall went the way it always went for famous names, that particular quality of silence that was actually heightened attention, everyone pivoting. Harry walked to the stool and sat down and let the hat be placed on his head with the easy composure of someone who'd been told what to expect and found the reality matched the description. The hat took a while. Snape watched. He was not, he told himself, particularly invested in the outcome. He watched all the sortings. It was a professional obligation. The hat announced Gryffindor, and the Gryffindor table erupted, and Harry pulled the hat off and went to sit down, and the last thing Snape saw before the next student was called was the boy saying something to the girl beside him that made her laugh. Snape picked up his goblet and drank. The feast went the way feasts went, noisy, prolonged, the annual ritual of children discovering that yes, it was really as good as the older student said, the food replenishing faster than it could be eaten, McGonagall doing her annual circuit of the Gryffindor table with the combined energy of someone welcoming her house members and cataloguing potential problems. Dumbledore gave his start-of-year speech with his usual measured warmth, the warnings about the third-floor corridor weaved in with enough practiced lightness that the first years mostly heard the warmth and filed the warning as routine. Snape heard the warning about the third-floor corridor as exactly what it was, which was bait, because he'd been listening to Dumbledore's speeches for over a decade and he knew what bait sounded like when the old man deployed it. He looked at the Gryffindor table and caught, briefly, Harry Potter listening to the speech with his head slightly tilted, the expression of someone parsing subtext. Interesting. He put it away and went back to his dinner. The first week of term was what it always was, the annual renegotiation of standards, the re-establishment of expectations, the discovery by new students that Hogwarts in practice was somewhat different from Hogwarts in theory. Snape's first-year potions class fell on Thursday, and he prepared for it the way he prepared for all his first-year classes, which was to say he prepared rigorously and allowed himself none of the particular anticipatory tension that wanted to creep in around the edges. The Gryffindor-Slytherin class came in at 2 o'clock. He watched them file in and take their seats and do the thing new students always did, which was establish their social geography in the first 4 minutes by choosing where to sit. Granger, he'd already identified her from the class lists, the muggle-born with the academic record that preceded her like a herald, sat down with her textbook already open, which told him everything about how she experienced classrooms. Weasley sat next to Potter with the ease of established friendship. Longbottom took a seat near the back, hunched slightly in the manner of a boy who'd decided preemptively to take up less space. Harry Potter sat in the middle of the room. Not front, not back. Not near the window. Directly in the middle, his equipment arranged on the desk with reasonable organization, and he looked at the board where Snape's initial instructions were written and read them properly rather than glancing at them. Snape stood up. He gave the speech. He gave the speech every year, the one about the subtle science and exact art, the one about the bewitching of minds and the ensnaring of senses, and he gave it well, because it was true, and because the quality of attention it produced in students who were genuinely listening was something he valued. He moved through the room as he talked, the rhythm of it familiar, the words finding their shape. "Potter," he said. Harry looked up. Immediately, directly, without the flinching start of someone unused to their name being called suddenly. Just looked up. What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood? A pause. Not the pause of someone who didn't know, the pause of someone deciding how to answer. A sleeping potion, Harry said. Draught of living death, specifically. It's in chapter 10. Which you've read. The whole book, over summer. He said this without any particular challenge in it, just as information. Most of them, actually. Snape looked at him for a moment. Those eyes, Lily's eyes, looking out from the boy with their particular quality of direct attention, gave him nothing he could work with beyond simple honesty. Where would you look if I asked you to find me a bezoar? Stomach of a goat. It's a poison antidote, it counteracts most poisons. A beet. You wouldn't use it in a potion, though. You'd use it as an emergency intervention. The chapter on antidotes makes that distinction. What is the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane? They're the same plant. Aconitum. Also called aconite. Harry paused. You know that, though. So the question is about whether I know it. Several students at nearby desks went very still. The Slytherins in particular seemed to collectively assess whether this was going to end badly and began planning for that outcome. Even Granger had stopped writing in her notebook. Snape looked at Harry Potter, who looked back with the same composed directness he'd had since he walked in, no bravado, no aggression, just the complete equanimity of a boy who was comfortable in his own skin and hadn't decided to be afraid yet. Snape turned away. 5 points to Gryffindor, he said. Don't get used to it. Open your books to page 7. He heard, behind him, the smallest exhale from Weasley. Granger had her book open before he finished the sentence. Harry Potter opened his in a manner suggesting he was perfectly familiar with its contents and considered the instruction reasonable anyway. Snape taught the class. It went well, in the specific way that classes went well when he started from a high standard and was willing to hold it. The students were challenged, most of them were engaged. Longbottom melted a cauldron handle which was almost impressive given that the first class was theoretical, And Harry Potter completed the basic mixing exercise with clean technique and an instinct for temperature adjustment that suggested someone had taught him informally and taught him correctly. He didn't say anything about that. He noted it and moved on. After class, the Gryffindors filed out and Snape was cleaning the board when he heard a voice say, "Professor?" Harry Potter was standing at the door with his bag over his shoulder. The rest of the class had gone. "The draft of Living Death," Harry said. "Is it covered later in the year, or is it seventh-year work?" Snape turned fully to look at him. "Why?" "Because the Asphodel question was the introduction and I want to know if we're working toward it." "It's covered in sixth year. Is there a reason it couldn't be introduced earlier?" He said it as a genuine question. Not pushback. Not the swaggering assumption that he should get special treatment. Honest curiosity from someone who'd read chapter 10 and wanted to go further. Snape looked at him. "Come and see me during my office hours," he said, which was not what he'd planned to say and was, he acknowledged privately, the only sensible response to the question actually being asked. "We'll discuss appropriate reading." Harry nodded and left. Simple as that. No gratitude performance, no visible excitement, just a nod and a departure, the way you'd respond when something reasonable had happened and there was nothing further to add. Snape stood in the empty classroom for a moment longer than necessary. He was not going to do this. He was not going to become invested in this child's academic development in a way that was personal rather than professional. He was going to treat Harry Potter exactly as he treated every other student, with genuine ability, with appropriate rigor and high standards, and nothing more. He was completely clear on this. He went to his office and added 2 additional texts to the list he kept of books available for capable students, then stopped himself from adding a third and put his quill down. He was almost clear on this. Word spread through the school the way word always spread through the school, which was instantly and imperfectly. By Friday evening the shape of the story in circulation was that Harry Potter had answered 3 rapid-fire questions from Snape in his first potions class and been given 5 points, which was considered remarkable enough to have achieved mythological status before the weekend. Snape heard 3 versions of it from passing students in the corridor and each one had embellished a different aspect. In one version Harry had been given 20 points, in another he had made some devastating remark that left Snape speechless, and in a third, his personal favorite for sheer inventiveness, he had brewed the draft of Living Death from memory. Harry himself seemed entirely unaware of his own legend, or aware of it and unimpressed, which Snape found he couldn't quite determine. He saw the boy properly on Saturday afternoon, when Harry came to his office hours with a list of questions written in a notebook, which Snape found both unusual and entirely sensible. Most students who came to office hours came with nothing, the vague petition of someone hoping the professor would remember what they needed. Harry sat down across the desk and opened the notebook and they talked for 45 minutes about the theoretical framework of potion making in a way that Snape could only describe as rigorous, because Harry asked good questions and followed up on the answers and pushed back when he thought something needed clarifying rather than simply accepting it. He also, at one point, asked about a specific technique in the Antidotes chapter that related to a notation in the margin of the library copy he'd been using, and Snape realized with a start that the notation was his own, from his 6th-year copy of that text, which had somehow ended up in general circulation. He'd been 15 when he wrote it. "The margin note is wrong, actually," Harry said. "Or it's incomplete. The timing it recommends doesn't account for temperature variance in the base potion." Snape looked at the notation. He looked at the boy. He thought about being 15 and how certain he'd been about that timing. "That's correct," he said. "The notation is outdated." Harry wrote something in his own notebook. "I'll add a correction. It's not your book. Someone else will read it." Snape looked at him again. There was nothing remotely remarkable about the statement Harry had just made. Correcting a wrong thing in a book so that the next person who read it would have correct information was the obviously right thing to do, and Harry had said it as though this were apparent. Snape thought about the kind of 10 years that produced this. The kind of home that produced this. He thought about Margaret Calloway in Edinburgh and the way the formal placement announcement had read, and he thought about that ceiling light and the laughing. He did not think about any of this visibly. "Leave a clear notation indicating the correction with a date," he said. "And come back next Saturday if you've read through chapter 15. I'll have it done by Wednesday." "Thursday, then." "I have a prior engagement Wednesday evening." Harry nodded and left. The prior engagement Wednesday was a meeting with Dumbledore that Snape would not have described as enjoyable under any circumstances but which, this particular week, had an additional layer of discomfort. Dumbledore's office was the same as always, the gentle chaos of collected magical objects, the portraits of previous headmasters dozing in their frames, Fawkes on his perch going through what appeared to be a preparatory phase for an imminent burning day and looking deeply unimpressed about it. "How are you finding the new first years?" Dumbledore asked, with the warm casualness of someone asking about the weather. "Adequate," Snape said. "Young Harry seems to be settling in well." Snape looked at him. "I've taught him once." "Indeed." Dumbledore offered a lemon drop, which Snape declined, which he always declined. "He's grown into rather a remarkable young man. The Calloways have done an extraordinary job." A pause, the careful pause of a man placing words. "You'll find he's quite different from what any of us might have expected." "I don't recall expecting anything." Dumbledore looked at him with the slightly amused attention of someone who knew this was not entirely true. "Severus," he said. "I find myself curious about something. Those memories, the ones that found their way to Amelia Bones, 10 years ago, were remarkably detailed. Remarkably well-timed." He folded his hands. The seal was sophisticated enough that Amelia never determined the sender's identity. "She told me that herself, which she wouldn't have done if she'd been protecting a known source." "Interesting," Snape said. Dumbledore looked at the ceiling. "I've thought about it a great deal, over the years. Someone who was there that night. Someone with access to memory charm techniques of that specificity. Someone who knew Amelia well enough to target her appropriately, or perhaps had encountered her magic before." He picked up the lemon drop he'd offered and held it without eating it. "I don't ask you to confirm anything. I simply thought you should know that the person who sent those memories gave Harry a childhood. Whatever their reasons." Silence. "Will that be all?" Snape said. Dumbledore smiled at him, not the managed warmth of his public expression but something quieter, something that Snape had only seen a handful of times in 20 years, an expression almost like genuine humility. "Almost. I wanted to say that I was wrong, 10 years ago. About the Dursleys. About many things." He paused. "I wanted to say it plainly, without qualification, because I'm aware that I have a tendency to qualify things that shouldn't be qualified." Snape looked at him for a long moment. Was there a strategic purpose to placing him there originally? Beyond the blood protection? "Yes," Dumbledore said quietly. "I thought the environment would produce a particular quality in him. A necessary quality." "Desperation," Snape said. "Desperation and a willingness to sacrifice himself for people who'd never given him reason to value himself." Dumbledore didn't answer. "And instead," Snape said, "he has self-possession and actually reads the textbooks. I'll try to manage." He stood up and left, and he did not look back, and he was 3 corridors away before he identified the sensation in his chest as something he hadn't felt since 5th year at the latest, which was that someone who deserved better had received it, and the world was, in this specific instance, fractionally less terrible than its average. He didn't let himself feel it for long. Old habits. Saturday afternoon, Harry came back with chapters 1 through 15 marked in his notebook and a very good question about stabilizing agents, and they talked for an hour, and Snape wrote a book recommendation on a piece of parchment and handed it across the desk, and Harry added it to a list he was already keeping. "How many books are on that list?" Snape asked, because he couldn't quite stop himself. Harry looked at it. 14, now. He paused. I finished 6 over summer. Margaret says I read too fast to actually absorb things, but I think she's wrong about that specifically. Margaret Calloway. Yes. He said it easily, naturally, the name of a person who was simply part of his life. She made me write summaries of every chapter as I went, which proved her point about absorbing things, except the summaries showed I'd absorbed everything, so actually it proved mine. Snape felt a dangerous impulse to smile and successfully suppressed it. What did she say to that? Harry considered. She said that just because you're right doesn't mean you're not annoying. He paused. I thought that was pretty fair. Snape looked at him, this boy who had Lily's eyes and nobody's particular damage, who argued about margin notes and made friends in sorting lines and treated a potions professor's office hours like a genuine resource rather than an ordeal. This boy who had been crying on a step in Surrey at midnight while a radio played somewhere else in the house, and who was now sitting across a desk from the man who'd watched it happen and discussing the relative merits of stabilizing agents with the ease of someone who had never had a reason to be afraid of adults. Thursday, he said. Chapter 20. Don't be late. Harry nodded, picked up his bag, and went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. Professor, he said. Can I ask you something that's not about potions? Snape waited. The third-floor corridor. Dumbledore mentioned it in his speech and it was, the way he mentioned it was strange. Like he wanted us to be curious about it. The headmaster said it was forbidden. Yes, Harry said. That's what I mean. He said it was forbidden in a way that was interesting rather than a way that was actually prohibitive. The specific phrasing. He paused. I was wondering if you'd noticed. Snape said nothing. Right, Harry said. Okay. And he left. Snape sat in his office in the quiet of the Saturday afternoon and looked at the wall and thought about Lily Evans at school, who had noticed things people said and what was underneath them and had been the only person he'd ever met who noticed things the way he noticed things, with the same quality of attention. He thought about what it meant that her son had walked in here and, in the space of a week, noticed something about Dumbledore's speech that took most adults years to identify. He thought about the Philosopher's Stone, which was in the third-floor corridor, which he knew about because he was on the protection detail and had been since July when Dumbledore had decided that several of Hogwarts' most capable professors constructing layered magical protections was sufficient security for a magical artifact powerful enough to make a man immortal. He thought about a boy on a doorstep and a door closing and a radio getting louder, and all the ways that could have gone differently. He thought about Harry Potter, 11 years old, noticing subtext. He opened his desk drawer and looked at the piece of parchment he kept there, not the memories, which he didn't have anymore, they were in Amelia Bones' sealed case file. Just a piece of parchment with nothing on it, which he had kept for reasons he'd never fully examined, from the morning he'd sat in a shop on a side street in Diagon Alley and written a letter to a woman he'd met once. He folded it and put it away. Down the corridor, Harry Potter was walking toward Gryffindor Tower, and Snape knew this without seeing it the way you knew the direction of a thing you'd been watching for a long time, the particular rightness of it. He picked up his quill. He had first-year essays to grade. They were mostly terrible. He was unreasonably satisfied with Harry Potter's, which was concise, precisely organized, and contained one observation about the relationship between solvent temperature and alkaloid extraction that was technically beyond the first-year curriculum and completely correct, and which Snape marked in red ink not to criticize but to note for future reference. He wrote "See me Thursday" in the margin. He put the essays aside and started in on the third years, which were worse, and the Saturday evening passed the way Saturday evenings passed, and somewhere in Edinburgh the Calloways were probably having dinner, and somewhere in the castle Harry Potter was probably reading ahead in a textbook, and somewhere in a sealed case file in the ministry a set of memories in a certified veil recorded a door closing against a sound. And that was all right. It was, Snape thought, as things went, all right. Chapter 4, What Dumbledore Doesn't Know. October arrived at Hogwarts the way it always did, suddenly, as though the castle had simply decided overnight that September was finished and the time had come for cold corridors and wood smoke and the particular quality of afternoon light that turned the lake the color of pewter. The trees on the grounds went gold and then burnt orange and then started shedding with an enthusiasm that drove Hagrid to distracted muttering about the gutters on his hut. Harry noticed all of it. He noticed most things. He'd been at Hogwarts for 6 weeks and had developed, with the efficient thoroughness that Margaret Calloway had spent 10 years alternately encouraging and gently moderating, a fairly complete picture of how the place worked. Not just the classes and the moving staircases and the ghosts, everyone got that in the first week, but the actual architecture of the place. Who held what kind of power? Where the decisions got made. Why Peeves listened to the Bloody Baron and no one else. Why Filch was angrier on Thursdays than on other days. Why Dumbledore's announcements during meals always came when everyone had eaten enough to be comfortable but not so much that they were drowsy, which was a specific choice about when people were most receptive to things. He'd shared this last observation with Hermione, who'd told him he was overthinking it, and then thought about it for a moment and said, "Actually, no, that's probably right." He'd shared it with Ron, who'd said, "Blimey, do you just notice things like this constantly?" And when Harry said yes, Ron said, "That sounds exhausting," with the sincere sympathy of someone whose relationship with the world was considerably more direct, and Harry had found this genuinely funny. Neville had said, "My Gran does the same thing at family dinners. She says the timing of information is half the information," which had elevated Neville several notches in Harry's estimation, as if the fact that Neville knew 17 uses for Mimbulus Mimbletonia hadn't already done that. The thing Harry was currently noticing, and had been noticing since the start of term with increasing attention, was Dumbledore. He liked Dumbledore. He wanted to be clear about this in his own mind, because he'd found that you could like someone and still think clearly about them, and the mistake was assuming the two were incompatible. Dumbledore was warm and funny and genuinely interested in people in a way that felt real rather than performed, and when he'd met Harry at the start of year feast and shaken his hand, there had been a quality to the attention that was significant. Like being seen by someone who was very good at seeing. But the third-floor corridor thing had started it, the speech that was a warning but also an invitation, which Snape had declined to confirm and hadn't denied either, which was its own kind of answer. Since then Harry had been collecting small things, the way you collected puzzle pieces before you could see the picture. The way Dumbledore asked questions that seemed casual but were precise. The way he positioned himself, physically, in conversations, always slightly angled toward Harry in a room, always aware of where he was. The way he referred to Harry's future in ways that were warm and proud and somehow didn't contain any actual question about what Harry himself wanted that future to look like. He'd mentioned this to no one except his notebook. He had a notebook, a Muggle one. Margaret had given him his first one when he was 6 and he'd been using them ever since, where he wrote observations in a shorthand that he'd developed himself, half-words and symbols and diagrams, the record of a mind that thought too fast for full sentences. The notebook had a section on Dumbledore. It was the longest section. He was in the library on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October, adding to it, when the noise from the corridor told him something had happened. Not danger noise, the castle had distinct acoustics for different events, he'd learned this early, but the noise of excited information moving fast, which in Hogwarts almost always meant something had gone wrong somewhere and the story was still forming. He found Ron outside the library door, slightly breathless. "Troll," Ron said. "There's a troll in the dungeon. McGonagall's rounding everyone up for the common room." "How?" "Halloween feast, someone let it in, nobody knows. Where's Hermione?" Ron's expression shifted. "She's been in the girls' bathroom on the 2nd floor. She doesn't know." They went. Harry had already done the mental geography before Ron finished explaining, 2nd floor bathroom, troll in the dungeon, which was below 2nd floor, the route between them, the fact that the bathroom door opened inward. He was running before he'd consciously decided to run and Ron was with him because Ron, whatever else he was, had the instinct to move toward a problem rather than away from it, which Harry thought was one of the more underrated qualities a person could have. They found Hermione in the bathroom, backed against the far wall, not screaming. She'd gone past screaming, Harry thought, into the white-faced paralysis that came after, while the troll worked through the cubicle doors with its club with the methodical destruction of something that had no malice in it, just weight and momentum. Harry looked at the troll. The troll was large and smelled enormously and was not paying attention to anything except the cubicles. He grabbed Ron's arm. "Distraction," he said. "Get it to look at you. I'll get Hermione out." "How are you going to? Please just do the distraction part, Ron." Ron yelled something at the troll that Harry didn't catch because he was already moving, circling wide around the edge of the room toward Hermione, using the troll's own noise as cover. He got to her, grabbed her hand, and she grabbed back with the grip of someone very frightened who had decided to trust, which was not nothing. "When I say go, you go," he said. "Don't look at it." "How are you going to? Ron's distracting it." "Go now." They moved. The troll turned toward Ron, which was what it was supposed to do, and Harry and Hermione were at the door before it registered there were now 3 small humans to be dealt with, and Harry held the door as Hermione went through and then went through himself, and the troll's club hit the doorframe a half-second behind him with a concussive crack that he felt in his back teeth. McGonagall appeared at the end of the corridor with Snape and Quirrell, and her expression as she took in the situation, the damaged doorframe, the 3 slightly disheveled first-years, the sounds of continued destruction from the bathroom, moved through several phases in rapid succession. "What? How, you 3, we came to warn Hermione," Ron said immediately. "She didn't know about the troll." McGonagall looked at Harry. Harry looked back. Snape was looking at the bathroom door with the expression of someone running rapid calculations. "That was exceedingly reckless," McGonagall said. "Yes," Harry agreed. "It worked, though." Snape made a sound that was very nearly something. McGonagall's mouth pressed into a thin line, but underneath the thin line was the complicated expression of someone who was trying to be appropriately stern about something that had also been, objectively, effective. 5 points each, she said. "And I don't want to hear about anything like this again this year." Harry didn't say anything. Ron looked like he wanted to say several things and wisely didn't say any of them. Hermione, who had recovered her composure with the speed of someone whose composure was a primary survival mechanism, said, "Thank you, Professor," in a slightly unsteady voice that was trying not to be. The troll was dealt with by the professors. Harry took mental note of the fact that Quirrell was extremely unhelpful throughout the process and that Snape seemed to be the one who actually immobilized it, working with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew precisely how. Walking back to Gryffindor Tower afterward, Hermione walked between him and Ron with the slightly self-conscious air of someone who'd had a self-sufficient self-image and had just been decisively rescued, and was working out what to do with that. "I was going to find a way out," she said, after a while. "I know," Harry said. "But it was faster this way." She looked at him sideways. "You're not going to make a thing out of it." "Why would I make a thing out of it?" She seemed to think about this, and then something settled in her expression that Harry recognized as a decision being made. She said, "Right, and nothing else," and by the time they reached the portrait hole they were arguing about whether Harry's decision to circle the room had been better than simply using a Wingardium Leviosa on the club, which Harry thought was too slow, which Hermione thought was more controlled, which Ron thought was both beside the point and an extremely good sign. Snape watched them go from the bottom of the corridor and thought about how none of that should have worked and how it had worked anyway and what that said about the quality of instinct versus the quality of training, and then he went to his office because Quirrell had been behaving strangely for 3 months and he needed to think about it somewhere quiet. He'd been thinking about Quirrell since July, when the man had come back from his year abroad wearing a turban and a slight smell that Snape's training identified and his conscious mind kept rejecting. He'd been close enough to that smell once to know exactly what it was, the edge of dark magic that was not casting but residing, the particular quality of power that lived in a person rather than being performed by them. He'd smelled it once in a room with Voldemort. He'd written down his suspicions and locked the parchment in his desk and then spent 2 months watching, because he'd been wrong before, and being wrong loudly in the direction of the headmaster was not a mistake he intended to repeat. By October he was not wrong. He was certain. The question was what to do about the certainty, and more specifically, what to do about the stone. He was on the protection detail for the stone. He'd built the potions puzzle himself, the layered logic and potion challenge that sat at the end of the gauntlet, and he was reasonably proud of it. It required both magical knowledge and actual reasoning, which he thought was more defensible than most of the protections, some of which he'd had reservations about since the design stage. He'd said so to Dumbledore, and Dumbledore had said the layered nature was the protection, and Snape had said that a chain was only as strong as its weakest link, and Dumbledore had given him the look that meant thank you for the observation, I've decided not to act on it. He'd gone back to his office and triple-checked his own contribution and said nothing else about it. Now there was something wearing Quirrell's body, and it wanted the stone, and it was in the building, and Harry Potter, who was 11 and had Lily's eyes and had been noticing Dumbledore's speeches for 6 weeks, was in the same building. He started watching Quirrell more closely. He went to every Quidditch match, not because he had any strong feelings about Quidditch, but because Quirrell attended them, and the one time Snape had taken his eye off Quirrell near Harry, a broomstick had made a spirited attempt to throw the boy. He'd countered the jinx mid-match with the controlled fury of someone who had been waiting for this and had prepared for it, while Quirrell looked at the broom with the theatrical concern of a man performing innocence. After the match, he'd found Harry in the changing rooms waiting for the rest of the team to finish, and said nothing about the broom because saying anything would have required explaining why he'd been watching Quirrell, and he wasn't ready to explain that. Harry said, "Thank you for the counter jinx." Snape looked at him. "What makes you think I felt the broom stabilize?" "It felt like yours." He said this with the same uncomplicated directness he used for everything else. "I've been in your potions class for 6 weeks, I know what your magic feels like when you cast. It's very precise." He paused. "Also, you were looking at Quirrell." Snape said nothing. "I've been looking at Quirrell too," Harry said. "Since the troll." He folded his Quidditch robes into his bag with the neat economy of someone who'd learned tidy habits early. It was too convenient, wasn't it? The troll appearing on Halloween specifically, during the feast, while everyone was together and occupied. Something let it in. And Quirrell was very late to the scene for someone whose classroom is in the dungeon. "You're 11, Snape said." "Yes." Harry looked up at him. "Is the troll connected to whatever's in the third-floor corridor?" Snape thought about lying. He thought about it with full awareness of how much easier lying would make the next several months, and then he thought about a margin note in a library book and a boy who'd said someone else will read it, and the specific quality of Lily Evans' eyes when someone treated her as though the truth were beyond her. "I strongly suggest," he said, "that you focus on your coursework and your Quidditch and nothing else until further notice." That's not a no. It's also not a yes. "Good evening, Potter." He left. Behind him Harry said nothing, and the nothing had the quality of a person who'd heard exactly what they needed to hear. The meeting with Dumbledore in late October was the one Snape had been navigating toward for 3 months, building his case with the careful accumulation of evidence that was the only language Dumbledore actually responded to when he'd already decided something. He laid it out. Quirrell. The smell. The broom incident. The timeline of the troll. The pattern of Quirrell's behavior around the third-floor corridor, the small deviations, the late evenings. Dumbledore listened. He listened in the way he did when he was genuinely processing something, the half-moon glasses low on his nose, his fingers steepled. When Snape finished he was quiet for a long moment. "You believe it's Tom," he said. "I believe it's something using Quirrell as a vessel, and the only thing I've encountered with that specific magical signature is the Dark Lord." Snape kept his voice even. "Whether he is in full reconstituted form or something lesser, I can't determine without closer access." "I see." A pause. "And the stone?" "Still protected. But the protections were designed as a deterrent, not an absolute barrier. They'll slow him." He paused. "They won't stop him forever." Dumbledore was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'm aware of the situation, Severus. I've been aware for some time." Snape looked at him. "How long?" "Since September. I've had the castle under additional monitoring since then." "And you haven't removed the stone?" "No." Snape heard this and filed it in the same mental folder as the third-floor corridor speech and the blood protection and the word necessary that Dumbledore used when he meant deliberately engineered. "You want him to try for it?" Dumbledore looked at him steadily. "I want to understand what form he's taken and what form he's capable of taking." And, he stopped. "And you want to see how Harry responds," Snape said. "If he encounters the situation. Harry is well protected. I've ensured, he is 11 years old and the thing wearing Quirrell's face tried to throw him from a broom 6 hours ago." Snape's voice stayed level by effort of will. "If your plan involves Harry Potter encountering whatever is in that corridor, he won't go near the corridor. He already knows something is there and has connected it to Quirrell. He told me this himself, this evening." Snape watched Dumbledore's expression change, very slightly, the faint recalibration of a man whose expectations had been revised. "He is not the child you were expecting." Silence. "No," Dumbledore said. "He isn't." And the thing in his voice was not disappointment, Snape realized, but something more complicated, a kind of wonder wrestling with a kind of loss, the expression of a man whose careful design had been replaced by something he hadn't designed and couldn't fully control, and who was working out, in real time, whether that was a problem. Snape went back to his dungeons and sat in his office and thought about whether he trusted the situation. He didn't. He trusted his own protection, and he trusted that Quirrell, if pressed, was not powerful enough in his current form to get through 6-layered challenges cleanly. But trust and comfort were different things, and he was not comfortable. He was in the middle of this thinking when McGonagall knocked. She came in and sat down in the chair across his desk without being invited, which was her prerogative and he didn't object to it. There were very few people in the world whose company he found tolerable, and she was one of them, despite everything. She sat with the upright precision of someone who had been carrying considerable posture for 50 years and had made peace with never putting it down. "You went to Dumbledore about Quirrell," she said. "Did he tell you?" "He told me enough." She folded her hands. "What did he say?" "That he was aware. That there are additional monitoring charms. That he doesn't intend to remove the stone." McGonagall looked at the wall behind his desk. Outside the castle the October wind was going, the kind that found the gaps in old stone and made them audible. She was silent long enough that Snape looked up from the papers he'd been pretending to shuffle. "I told him in 1981 that I didn't like leaving the boy with the Dursleys," she said. "I watched that street for a whole day." "I know. I wrote him a letter. He said he understood my concerns." She paused. "He said the blood protection was the greatest available safeguard. He made it sound very convincing. He usually does." She looked at him then, directly, with the sharp focus she used when she decided to say something that might be unwelcome. "Whoever sent those memories to Amelia Bones saved that boy from something I didn't prevent despite being right there." She let that sit for a moment. "I've thought about it a great deal." Snape said nothing. "Minerva," he said, after a moment, "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "Harry is going to go to the third-floor corridor. I don't know when, but he's going to. He's already identified it as relevant and he doesn't sit with relevant information passively." He paused. "When he does, I want to be prepared rather than reactive. I need you to be the same." She looked at him. "You're telling me this rather than Dumbledore." "Dumbledore already knows. He's made his strategic calculations." A long pause. The wind went. One of the candles on Snape's desk guttered. "What do you need?" she said. "I need to know the moment anything happens with Quirrell that falls outside normal patterns. Not through Dumbledore's monitoring, directly." You notice things, Minerva. You noticed him the same evening I did, at the start of term. I saw your face at the staff table. She acknowledged this with a very small nod. And I need you to trust me, he said, if the situation moves faster than we planned for. She looked at him for a long moment with the expression she'd been wearing, he suspected, since she first looked at him across a classroom at Hogwarts and found a student who she couldn't fully read and couldn't stop watching. I've always trusted you, she said. Even when I didn't like what I was trusting you to do. I know. She stood up. She straightened a robe that was already straight. He beat you to the question, you know, she said, at the door. About Quirrell. What? Harry. He came to my office 2 weeks ago. He asked me if I knew why Professor Quirrell smelled strange. She paused with her hand on the door. I told him I'd noticed it as well and that it was being looked into. He said, thank you, that's what I needed to know, and left. She made a small sound that might, in someone else, have been a laugh. He's really quite something. She left. Snape sat in the quiet and thought about Harry Potter, 11 years old, coming to McGonagall's office 2 weeks ago to ask about Quirrell's smell. He thought about the fact that Harry had therefore known for 2 weeks and said nothing to his friends and had not gone near the 3rd floor and had just held it. Filed it. Waited. That was not the behavior of a child looking for adventure. That was the behavior of a very specific kind of person who had identified a real threat and was deciding how to respond to it intelligently rather than immediately. He pulled out a piece of parchment. He wrote a list of the protections in the 3rd floor corridor, not all of them, not Dumbledore's and Flitwick's and the others, but his own. He wrote out the logic of the potion puzzle completely, with enough detail that someone reading it would be able to work through it without error. He sealed it and put it in the inside pocket of his robes. He did not plan to give it to Harry Potter. He planned to have it available in case the alternative was not having it available, which was a different thing entirely. November came. The castle settled into its winter mode, darker earlier, colder in the mornings, the 3rd floor corridor sitting in its particular forbidden silence at the end of the right-hand side of the 3rd floor like a held breath. Harry's Thursday sessions in Snape's office had continued with the kind of regularity that surprised Snape slightly, given that they'd started as a practical arrangement about advanced reading and had become something else, not quite mentorship and not quite the ordinary student-teacher dynamic, something in between that neither of them had named. Harry brought questions and Snape answered them, and sometimes Snape asked questions back, and the questions he asked back were, he was aware, more interesting than the ones he asked his regular classes. He asked them as questions, not tests. Harry answered them as questions. On the 2nd Thursday of November Harry came in and sat down and put his notebook on the desk and said, I've been thinking about the Mirror of Erised. Snape looked up. That's not in any text I've given you. I know. I found a reference to it in Flamel's early theoretical work. The Principle of Desire Reflection in Magical Objects. He opened the notebook. If you were constructing a set of protections for something extremely valuable and you wanted the last layer to be essentially unbreakable regardless of the attacker's power level, something that reflected desire back at the seeker so they couldn't actually access what they were looking for, that would work very well. Snape looked at him. I'm not asking you to confirm it's there, Harry said. I'm just thinking out loud. That's a fairly sophisticated piece of thinking for someone working from a footnote in Flamel. I've been thinking about it for a few weeks. He paused. Whoever designed that layer is clever. Very different design philosophy from the potions puzzle, which is more confrontational, I suppose. The potions puzzle wants you to know you're being tested. The mirror would just quietly catch you. He tapped his pen on the notebook. The potions puzzle is solvable, if you're calm and think clearly. The mirror is solvable only if you don't want what you want. Snape said, very carefully, you've given this a great deal of thought. Yes. Harry looked up. His face was the same as always, not anxious, not performing. Just present and thoughtful and direct. Professor. If something were to happen with the stone, if someone were to actually try for it, I want you to know that I'm not going to do anything reckless. Your definition of reckless is somewhat flexible. No, it isn't. The troll was calculated. I've been watching Quirrell for 2 months. He paused. I'm telling you this because I think you've been watching him too, and I think we're both in a situation where the person in charge has decided that a degree of danger is strategically acceptable, and I want you to know that I understand that and I'm not going to put myself in an unmanageable position. The office was very quiet. You're telling me this, Snape said, so that I don't worry. Harry seemed to think about this. I'm telling you this because you've paid attention to me since I arrived and not because I'm famous. You argue with me about potions. You answer actual questions. He paused. I don't know why, specifically, but I think you have reasons. And I thought you should know I'm not going to get myself killed. He said this last part with the straightforward certainty of someone stating a preference rather than making a promise. That is not entirely within your control, Snape said. Most of it is. He picked up his notebook. I finished through chapter 22. Can we talk about the stability of emotion-based potions? I think there's a design flaw in the standard Amortentia formulation. Snape looked at him. He thought about all the things he wanted to say and said none of them. He pulled out the chapter 22 reference text and opened it and said, the instability you're seeing is in the base emulsion. Tell me what you've observed. And they worked, and the November evening went dark outside the window, and somewhere above them the third-floor corridor sat in its waiting silence, and Severus Snape thought, with the private and carefully unexpressed ferocity of a man who had been afraid for 10 years, that whatever happened next, Harry Potter was going to be all right. He didn't know how he knew. He knew. Chapter 5, The Stone and the Mirror. The thing about traps, Harry had decided, was that they were only dangerous if you didn't know they were traps. He'd been thinking about this since October, turning it over the way you turned a particularly interesting problem, examining it from different angles. Dumbledore had built the stone's protection as a deliberate challenge, not impenetrable, not designed to be, but designed to be solvable by someone specific under specific conditions. The logic of it had a shape. The question was whether the shape had been designed for Quirrell, or for Harry, or for both, and whether the answer to that question changed what Harry should do about it. He'd filled half a notebook with this thinking and shared none of it with anyone except, obliquely, Snape, and Snape had not confirmed or denied anything, which was its own kind of data. December arrived. The castle filled with the particular anticipatory tension of the end of term, essays due, exams threatening, the slow bleed of students toward the Christmas holidays. Harry had already decided to stay. The Callaways were spending Christmas in France with their daughter's family and had invited him, and he'd thought about it seriously and decided that whatever was going to happen with Quirrell was going to happen before spring, and he wanted to be here when it did. He'd written Margaret explaining this in terms that were accurate without being alarming. She'd written back saying she understood, that she worried about him constantly as a matter of principle, that he should eat properly, and that she'd left a package with Hestia Jones who would get it to Hogwarts before Christmas morning. He loved her for all of that, including the worrying. The night everything moved was the 19th of December. Harry knew it was moving because Neville came to find him at dinner with the wide-eyed expression of a boy carrying information he wasn't sure what to do with, and said, quietly, into the ambient noise of the great hall, Quirrell. I was walking past the staff room and he came out and he looked, wrong. Pale. Moving fast. Harry looked at the staff table. Quirrell's seat was empty. Snape's seat was empty. McGonagall was present, eating with her usual composure, but she was also looking at the doors. Harry stood up. Harry, Hermione said. I need to go. We're coming with you, Ron said, which was not a question. Harry looked at him. He looked at Hermione, who had already pushed her plate back with the resigned expression of someone who'd known this was coming and had decided to be prepared rather than surprised. He looked at Neville, who was pale but present and clearly not planning to go anywhere. "You don't have to," Harry said. "Obviously," Hermione said, standing up. "Come on." They went. The third-floor corridor was unlocked, not by their doing. Someone had already opened it, and the door stood 3 inches ajar with the quality of something that had been opened quickly and in the dark. Harry pushed it open the rest of the way and felt the immediate warm animal breath of the 3-headed dog, which was lying sideways with the heavy boneless abandon of something deeply asleep. A harp was on the floor nearby, the last notes of its enchantment fading. "Cerberus," Neville said. "Music." Someone brought it music. "Quirrell," Harry said. He looked at the trapdoor, which was open, and then looked at his 3 friends. "I need you to understand something. We go down, we keep together, we don't take any unnecessary risks, and if at any point the situation becomes unmanageable we come back up and go directly to McGonagall. Are we agreed?" "Agreed," Hermione said immediately. "Agreed," Neville said. Ron said, "Agreed," with the expression of someone agreeing to something while privately reserving the right to revise his definition of unmanageable on the fly. Harry went through the trapdoor first. The devil's snare was below, he felt it before he landed, the reaching tendrils of it, and he cast Lumos Maxima with the full force of a spell performed at speed and the plant recoiled, the tight grasp of it releasing, and the others dropped through into the cleared space. Hermione was already casting her own light by the time she landed. Neville said, "Lumos," in a voice that was slightly too high but entirely functional. The second chamber had the winged keys, and here Harry paused because Quirrell would have had to find the right key on a broomstick, which took time even for a skilled flyer. Harry looked at the keys and looked at Ron, and Ron was already scanning them the way he scanned a chess problem, with the rapid pattern recognition of someone who'd been doing this since he was 4. "The worn one," Ron said. "Third tier, left side. That lock's been used." Harry was on the broomstick and had the key before the rest of them had finished looking, and the door was open in under 2 minutes. He heard Ron mutter something about that not being fair, which was probably a compliment. The chessboard was Snape's puzzle. No, wait, the chessboard was someone else's. He had a moment of re-evaluation as they stood at the edge of it. The chess pieces were enormous and white and waiting with the controlled patience of things that had been built for violence and didn't mind how long they stood ready for it. "This is mine," Ron said, in a tone Harry hadn't heard from him before. Flat and certain, the tone of someone who'd found the landscape where they were most themselves. Harry looked at him and felt something that was not quite concern and not quite pride, some combination of both. "Ron. I've been playing chess since I could hold the pieces. Let me do this." He looked at the board with the absolute focus of a natural. "You're a bishop," he said to Harry. "Hermione, you're there. Neville, that rook. What are you?" Harry asked. Ron looked at the knight. "A sacrifice, if I need to be." Harry said, "Ron, it's chess, Harry. Sometimes you give up a piece to win. I know what I'm doing." He looked at Harry steadily, and the steadiness was real, not bravado. "I know what I'm doing." Harry closed his mouth. They took their places. Ron played the board with the quiet authority of someone who genuinely understood what the other pieces couldn't see from their positions, calling moves in a steady voice, directing them through the white pieces' responses. He was brilliant at it. Harry could see it in real time, the beauty of the thinking, each move predicated on 3 moves ahead and accounting for variables that Harry wasn't even tracking. Hermione was taking notes, he noticed, which was so characteristic that he almost laughed. The moment came. Ron looked at the position, and Harry saw him calculate it, and saw when he arrived at the conclusion. He looked at Harry. "I go there," Ron said. "The Queen takes me. It puts you in position." "There's another way," Harry said. "There isn't." He said it without drama. "I've looked. I've looked twice." He was already guiding the knight toward the square. "It's all right. It's unconsciousness, not, It's all right. Go finish it. Harry looked at him. He thought about arguing and looked at the board again and knew with the cold clarity of someone who actually understood chess that Ron was right. There wasn't another way. He'd looked too. I'll come back for you, Harry said. I know. Ron nodded at the far door. Go. The Queen took Ron with a violence that made Hermione make a sound Harry felt in his ribs. Ron hit the stone floor hard, and Harry was already moving to check his pulse before the white piece was back in position, and he was alive and breathing, and Harry made himself stand up and walk away from him, which was one of the harder things he'd done. The next room had the troll, already unconscious, Quirrell's work, and then the fire-riddle room, and Harry stopped. The table had the potions. The fire in front and the fire behind and the small vials, and the note, and Harry read it once and read it again and felt, underneath the urgency, a quality of recognition. The precision of it. The design that wanted you to think rather than act. The particular combination of logic and knowledge that assumed the person solving it was capable of both. He'd sat across Snape's desk for 2 months and learned what his mind tasted like. This felt like Snape's mind. This is solvable, Hermione said, reading the note over his shoulder. I know. He was already working through it. Size didn't tell you wine from poison, but the note gave him enough logic to triangulate. It took 4 minutes. He was fairly sure about the answer and fully sure about his reasoning, which was not the same as certainty but was the closest available. The smallest bottle, he said. I'm almost certain. Almost, Hermione said. About as certain as I ever am about anything. He picked it up and looked at it. It was about a mouthful, which was clearly intentional. You take Ron back up. Get to McGonagall. Hermione looked at him. She was afraid, she was quite clearly afraid, the fear sitting plainly in her expression in a way that Hermione didn't usually allow, which told him she'd decided honesty was more important than composure right now. Harry. I'll be careful. That's not what she stopped. She looked at him for a moment and seemed to decide that what she wanted to say was not the thing that was needed, and said instead, come back. Plan to, he said. He drank the potion. It was cold. That was the first thing, intensely cold, spreading from his throat outward in a way that was startling and then resolved into something that felt like clarity rather than discomfort, the particular sensation of being very awake. He waited to make sure it wasn't wrong, and it wasn't, and he walked through the black fire. The room beyond was smaller than he'd expected. Not the chamber. The mirror of Eriste stood there, enormous and ornate against the far wall, its frame carved with words that ran backwards around the edge. The glass was dark and reflective and gave the room back to itself. The stone was not here, or not visibly here, which meant it was here, of course, because the mirror was the last protection and this was where the design ended. And there was Quirrell. He was standing with his back to Harry, looking into the mirror, and Harry had a moment to observe him before he turned. He looked wrong in a way that had nothing to do with the obvious things, not just the turban, not just the smell, but something structural, the way he moved and held himself, as though the body were being worn rather than inhabited. The smell was stronger here, closed room, no ventilation, and Harry breathed through his mouth and kept his wand up. Quirrell turned. Harry Potter, he said. His voice was off, the familiar stutter was gone, and what was left was flat and controlled in a way that the stutter had been concealing. I wondered when you'd arrive. Then you've been expecting me, Harry said. You've been watching me for months. A thin smile. Did you think I didn't notice? I thought you noticed and decided I wasn't a significant threat. Harry looked at the mirror. You haven't got it yet. Quirrell's expression shifted. It was not embarrassment, it was the controlled irritation of a man who'd been forced to admit something to himself. The mirror is uncooperative. Because you want it. Harry had worked this out at Snape's desk on a Thursday evening in November and he was gratified to be right, though the circumstances of being right were not particularly enjoyable. Whatever you see in there isn't giving it to you. You see yourself with it, and so it stays where it is. Quirrell looked at him with something that might have been appreciation in a different context. You've done your reading. Always. Harry kept his wand steady. Where's Dumbledore? Away. Quirrell moved slightly, not quite toward him, the motion of someone assessing vectors. Waylaid. My master has his methods. Your master, Harry said. Right. You say that as though, take the turban off. Silence. The room felt different suddenly, the air pressure shifting in the particular way that happened when a great deal of power moved from stillness to potential. Quirrell's hand went to the turban in a gesture that was not quite voluntary. My master, said a voice that was not Quirrell's voice and did not come from Quirrell's mouth, would like to speak to you directly. Harry had thought about this moment. He'd actually sat down in early November and thought about it deliberately, with the structured approach that Margaret had taught him, what might happen, what he'd feel if it did, whether the feeling would stop him from thinking. He'd concluded that it probably wouldn't, and he turned out to be right about that too. The terror was present, he acknowledged it, it was the honest response to the situation, his body was doing the correct biological things for someone standing in a small room with the shade of Voldemort, but it was there and he was also here, and those two things could coexist. The turban unwound. The face on the back of Quirrell's head was grey and barely human, the face of something that had survived by force of will past every reasonable limit, pressed flat against the back of a skull that wasn't its own. Its eyes were red. Its expression was the expression of a thing that had been many things and was now reduced to this and had made a particular peace with that reduction. Harry looked at it and didn't look away. Harry Potter, it said. The voice was soft, which he hadn't expected. Not weak, precise. The softness of something that didn't need volume because it had other methods. You're quite different from what I expected. I've been told that, Harry said. You're not afraid. I'm afraid, Harry said. I'm just thinking anyway. Something moved in those red eyes. Your mother's son. Yes. The word landed flat and final. And she's the reason you're in the back of someone else's head. Quirrell made a sharp movement, less the reaction of a person and more the reaction of something that had lost a contest of control briefly, and the red eyes narrowed. The stone, Voldemort said. You can see me the position I'm in. I require the stone and you require, what? What does Harry Potter want, standing in this room with everything and nothing to lose? I want you not to have the stone, Harry said. He moved toward the mirror. Quirrell moved to intercept and Harry cast without breaking stride, not the Expelliarmus he'd been practicing for 2 months with a kind of religious consistency, but the shield charm with enough force to stop Quirrell mid-step, not to incapacitate, just to hold a half-second, and in that half-second Harry was at the mirror. He looked in. He'd thought about what he'd see. He'd wondered, in the way you wondered about things you couldn't fully anticipate, what his truest desire would look like reflected back at him. The Calloways. Lily and James Potter, who he'd never known but whose photographs he'd looked at on Margaret Calloway's mantelpiece for 10 years. Something abstract, maybe. Justice. A world without this. What he saw was himself, standing in this room, taking the stone out of his pocket and putting it somewhere Voldemort couldn't reach it. Just that. Nothing transcendent. No grand desire, no constellation of wishes. Just himself, doing what he was here to do, competently and without ceremony. He felt something press into his hand and looked down. The stone was in his palm. He'd wanted to get the stone to keep Voldemort from using it. The mirror had given it to him. He stood there for approximately 1 second understanding fully what's Snape's design, and he was certain now it was Snape's design. This was the most elegant piece of thinking he'd encountered, what Snape's design had actually achieved, and then he closed his hand around the stone and turned around. Quirrell lunged. What happened next was fast in the way that things were fast when everyone in the room was moving at the same time with different goals. Quirrell's hands closed around Harry's wrist, and there was a sensation that Harry had no framework for, searing, not heat exactly, more like the magical equivalent of two wrong charges making contact, a violent incompatibility at the level of the thing that made him who he was. Quirrell screamed. Harry felt it through his whole body, the burning climbing his arm, and Quirrell was releasing him and not releasing him, caught between the pain and the need, his face contorted. The red eyes were looking at Harry over Quirrell's shoulder with something that was not quite fear and not quite anything else Harry had a name for. "Let go of me," Voldemort said. "Let go, you idiot, Quirrell, let go." Harry staggered back. His arm was burning from wrist to shoulder with a deep bone-level ache, and Quirrell was staring at his hands with the expression of someone whose hands had betrayed him, the skin of his palms red and blistered. "Interesting," the red eyes said, very quietly. "Your mother's sacrifice. It's still in you." "Apparently," Harry said. He was breathing hard. The stone was still in his hand. Quirrell came at him again. Harry didn't run, which was the thing nobody expected and which worked precisely because it was unexpected. He stepped forward into the reach, grabbed Quirrell's arm with his burned hand, and held. The sensation redoubled, the burning, the violent incompatibility, and Quirrell screamed and Harry held and the room filled with a light that had nothing to do with the torches, a white gold light, and the voice of Voldemort saying something that was not words, something that was rage in a purer form than language could hold, and then the door behind Harry opened. Snape came through the door of the fire room at something close to a run, which Harry had never seen him do, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been moving very fast for very long and had arrived and found the situation exactly as bad as he'd feared and was dealing with it. He took in the room in one sweep. Harry. Quirrell, crumpling. The light. The stone. The face on the back of Quirrell's head, which was doing something that was not quite fading, retreating, more accurately, pulling back from the vessel as the vessel failed, a departure from a form that was becoming untenable. "Get away from him," Snape said. His wand was up, not at Harry but at Quirrell, the professional readiness of someone who'd decided precisely what he was prepared to do. Harry stepped back. Quirrell hit the floor, not dramatically, just folded, the way things folded when what was animating them lost interest, and the retreating presence moved through the room like a change in air pressure and was gone. Not destroyed. Harry didn't think destroyed was available, not yet, not this way. Just, retreated. The red eyes, last, looking at Harry from somewhere that was already somewhere else, with an expression Harry would think about later when he had time to think about things properly. Curiosity. That was what it looked like. Whatever Voldemort was and whatever he'd been and whatever he was going to be next, he had looked at Harry Potter and been curious. Harry put the stone in his pocket. His arm was still burning. Snape was crouched over Quirrell, checking his pulse with the focused efficiency of someone performing a professional assessment. He looked up at Harry. "Are you hurt?" "My arm." "He grabbed me." Harry held it out. "It's not serious." Snape looked at the marks, reddened, similar to the burns on Quirrell's hands in reverse, and cast a diagnostic with his wand, the quick sweep of it. Something in his expression shifted, tightened. "You used the contact." "Yes." "Deliberately." It seemed like the available option. Snape stood up. He was looking at Harry with the expression that Harry had seen on his face exactly twice before and never found a proper name for, not pride, or at least not only that, something more specific and more complicated, the expression of someone who has been expecting something to go wrong for a very long time and has just watched it go right instead. "The stone," Snape said. Harry took it out of his pocket and put it in Snape's outstretched hand. Snape looked at it. It sat in his palm, a deep red, smaller than everyone seemed to expect, warm from Harry's hand. He closed his fingers around it and then looked at Harry again. "Dumbledore will need to be told," Harry said. "Yes." "He let this happen." A pause. "Yes." "Not Quirrell specifically. He positioned this so that there was a chance I'd be in that room." I don't think he planned every detail, but the broad shape of it. Harry stopped. He wanted to see what I'd do. Snape's expression did not change significantly. What makes you think that? Because the broom jinx at the Quidditch match should have been enough to involve the Aurors, and it wasn't. Because Quirrell's been here all term being obviously suspicious, and nobody's moved him. Because the stone is still here, in a school full of children, when it could have been anywhere. Harry kept his voice even. He arranged the conditions for something to happen and waited to see how I'd handle it. Silence. The torches burned. Quirrell lay on the floor, breathing shallowly, the turban half unwound around his head like a question that had been answered badly. Was I wrong? Harry asked. Snape looked at him. He looked at him for a long moment and then looked at the door and then looked back. No, he said. You were not wrong. Harry absorbed this. He absorbed it the way he absorbed things, completely and without visible drama, filing it accurately rather than letting it distort. He was not angry. He was not particularly hurt. He was disappointed in the specific, clear-eyed way of someone who had liked a person and updated their assessment of them based on evidence. That was what it was. He didn't need it to be anything else. Right, he said. Then I suppose we go up. They went up through the fire, Snape's long dark robes touching the black flame briefly, the cold of the potion room, the stairs. Harry's arm ached with the steady deep pulse of a magical injury and he carried it slightly away from his body without remarking on it. They found Hermione at the top of the trapdoor with McGonagall, and Ron on a conjured stretcher, still unconscious but breathing well. Hermione looked at Harry's arm and then looked at his face and then said, "You're all right," not as a question. "More or less," he said. McGonagall was looking at Snape with an expression that asked several things at once. Snape put the stone in his pocket and said, "It's done," and she looked at Harry and he saw her doing the same calculation Snape had done, running the situation against what she knew of Harry and arriving at a conclusion that seemed to resolve something she'd been holding. She reached out and gripped his shoulder briefly, not a hug, she was not a woman who hugged casually, but the grip of someone expressing something without words. He looked up at her and she looked at him and that was that. Dumbledore arrived 12 minutes later, through the main doors, which meant someone had sent for him and he traveled back at speed. He came down the corridor with the measured urgency of a man who'd been running but wanted to arrive, appearing as though he hadn't been. He was slightly out of breath. He looked at all of them, McGonagall, Snape, Harry, the stretcher, Hermione, Neville, who had appeared from somewhere, the details of which Harry gathered was a whole separate story involving the castle's east staircase and a very confused Peeves, and he looked at the open trapdoor, and he looked at Snape's pocket, and his expression was complex. "Harry," he said. "Sir," Harry said. Dumbledore studied him. Harry let him look without helping him with it, without arranging his expression in any particular direction. He was tired. His arm hurt. He was waiting to see what Dumbledore said next. "You're unhurt?" "Mostly." He tilted the arm slightly. "I see." A pause. "You went down?" "Yes." "May I ask why?" Harry looked at him. He thought about what he wanted to say, and how to say it, and whether now was the time. He looked at Snape, who was standing slightly to the side with the careful stillness of someone who had decided that this conversation was Harry's to run, and at McGonagall, who was watching Dumbledore with the expression of a woman keeping a great many words behind her teeth. "Because something living in Professor Quirrell tried to kill me at the Quidditch match," Harry said, "and then nothing official happened about it, and I thought it was better to address the situation directly than wait for it to address me on worse terms." Dumbledore looked at him for a long, long moment. The portraits of the corridor's predecessors watched from their frames, several of them had come along from adjacent walls, the painted audience of a school that had been observing itself for 1,000 years. Fawkes, improbably, had appeared at Dumbledore's shoulder, which Harry had known about theoretically and was finding somewhat startling in practice. "You could have been killed," Dumbledore said. "Yes." Harry looked at him steadily. "That's the part I'd like to discuss with you." "Not tonight. Tonight I think we all need to sleep and Ron needs a healer and I need my arm looked at. But I would like to have that conversation." Dumbledore looked at him. And Harry saw it again, the thing he'd seen in Snape's face, in McGonagall's grip, the moment of recalibration, the revision of a picture that had been drawn with different assumptions. Dumbledore had the picture of the boy who needed to be shaped, who could be guided and positioned and arranged like a piece on a board, and Harry was standing in front of him as evidence that the picture had always been wrong. "Of course," Dumbledore said, quietly. And then, very carefully, as though he were a man who had just understood something and was deciding how to hold it, "Of course, Harry." Fawkes leaned forward and touched Harry's arm with one brilliant tail feather. The burning eased, not all at once but in a long warm wash, the magical wound pulling back from the bone and settling into something manageable. Harry looked at the phoenix and the phoenix looked at him with eyes that were old and warm and entirely unconcerned with everything that had just happened. "Thank you," Harry said, to the bird, because it seemed correct. Fawkes made a sound that the portraits afterwards described in 6 different ways. Harry thought it was simply agreement. He looked at Snape. Snape was looking back with the steady dark attention he'd been looking at Harry with since the first potions class, and for a moment, with his arm warm and the stone safe in Snape's pocket and the rest of his first year at Hogwarts arranged around him, Ron on a stretcher, Hermione still holding her notebook, Neville standing slightly behind McGonagall with the expression of someone who had had an extremely significant evening and was processing it in real time. Harry thought about everything he'd worked out over the past weeks. About November 1st, 1981. About Privet Drive. About the seal on a box that only opened for one person's magic. He'd been thinking about it since September when Margaret, the night before the Hogwarts Express, had told him the full story of what she knew. Not everything, she didn't know everything, but enough. The anonymous memories. Amelia Bones and the certified vials. The wooden box. The particular kind of person who would do something like that and not tell anyone. He'd thought about it during the first potions class when Snape had answered his questions like they were worth answering. He'd thought about it every Thursday. He'd thought about it tonight, coming through the black fire, reading the logic of the potion puzzle and recognizing the mind behind it. He said, in the corridor in front of everyone and no one in particular, "Was it you? Who sent the memories to Amelia Bones?" The night of November 1st, 1981. The corridor went completely still. McGonagall's breath caught, audible in the quiet. Dumbledore became very carefully composed. Hermione looked between Harry and Snape with the rapid assessment of someone connecting things she hadn't finished connecting until this moment. Snape looked at Harry. He looked at him for a long moment, long enough that Harry thought he wasn't going to answer, that the question would fold back into the silence and they'd move on and nothing would be said. Long enough to be its own answer. "Go to the hospital wing," Snape said. "Get your arm properly treated." Harry held his gaze. His arm was warm from Fawkes. The stone was in Snape's pocket. Ron was breathing steadily on his stretcher. The corridor portraits were leaning forward to a degree that several of them were in danger of falling off their frames. "Okay," Harry said. "I already know, though. I just wanted you to know that I know." He looked at Snape for one more second, not challenging, not demanding anything, just looking at him the way he looked at things that were worth looking at properly, and then he turned and walked down the corridor toward the hospital wing, and Hermione fell into step beside him and said nothing for a while, and then said, "He's not going to confirm it." "He already did," Harry said. She considered this. "By not denying it. By looking at me like that." She was quiet again. "Then, why didn't you ask him in private?" "Because he spent 10 years not getting credit for it." Harry kept walking. He should have to hear at least one person say they know. Behind them, in the corridor, Severus Snape stood with his hand in his pocket around a smooth red stone, and did not move for a long time. Chapter 6, after the hospital wing was quiet by midnight. Ron had woken up an hour after Madame Pomfrey got hold of him, disoriented and then immediately demanding to know if they'd got the stone, and when Harry said yes he'd said, "Brilliant," and gone back to sleep with the satisfied expression of someone who'd completed their contribution and was comfortable with that. Hermione had stayed until Pomfrey threatened to give her a bed of her own, and then left with the reluctant efficiency of someone who wanted to stay but recognized the logic of going. Neville had appeared briefly at the door, checked that everyone was alive, said, "Good," with considerable feeling, and disappeared. Harry lay in the hospital wing bed with his arm properly healed. Pomfrey had tutored over the magical burn with professional displeasure, applied 3 different salves and a binding charm, and told him it would be fine by morning with the brisk certainty of someone who had seen worse before breakfast, and looked at the ceiling and thought. He was not in the habit of not thinking. He'd tried it once and found it unconvincing. What he was thinking about was the conversation he'd said he wanted to have with Dumbledore. He'd meant it. He'd said it in the corridor with the full intention of following through and had spent the last 2 hours organizing what he wanted to say, the way he organized anything important: start with what he actually knew, distinguish it from what he inferred, decide what he wanted the outcome to be before he said anything, because knowing what you wanted was the only way to tell if you were getting it. What he knew, Dumbledore had known Voldemort was in the building. Had let the situation develop rather than resolve it. Had arranged conditions that made it likely Harry would encounter those conditions at some point, even if the specific night hadn't been orchestrated. What he inferred, this was not a one-time choice. This was a pattern. The careful positioning, the information withheld, the paths made available rather than blocked. Dumbledore was building something, and Harry was a load-bearing part of it, and the building had been going on since before Harry arrived at Hogwarts. What he wanted, to make it clear, without aggression, that he understood this, and that understanding it changed things. Not to destroy the relationship, he genuinely liked Dumbledore and found his company interesting and didn't want to lose the access, but to put it on different terms. Terms where Harry was a person with his own judgment rather than a piece with a designated square. He thought he could do that. He fell asleep organizing the conversation and woke up to December sunlight and Pomfrey removing the binding charm and telling him the arm was healed and he could go to breakfast. He went to breakfast. Dumbledore was at the staff table. Their eyes met and Dumbledore gave him the small nod of a man who had been thinking overnight about the same conversation and had reached his own set of conclusions. Harry nodded back and ate his porridge. The Gryffindor table was alive with the aftermath. The story had moved through the castle overnight in the way stories moved, picking up detail and losing accuracy in equal measure, and the version currently in circulation involved Harry fighting Voldemort hand-to-hand in a chamber of fire, which was not entirely wrong but was missing several relevant pieces. Harry answered questions in the way he'd learned to answer questions about his own legend, which was briefly and factually and then redirecting to something else, and Ron did a credible job of providing supplementary detail while Hermione periodically corrected the supplementary detail, and by the end of breakfast the Gryffindor table had a reasonable approximation of what had happened. Draco Malfoy, across the hall, watched all of this with an expression Harry had been cataloging since September, not simply hostility but something more complicated, the expression of a person who'd been told a story about what the world looked like and was accumulating evidence that the story might be wrong, and not yet sure what to do with that. Harry had made a deliberate decision early in term not to engage Malfoy's hostility as hostility, to respond to it instead as information, which seemed to confuse Malfoy more than anything else Harry could have done. He wasn't going to think about Malfoy today. Malfoy was a year-long project and today had its own agenda. Dumbledore's office at 2 in the afternoon. Harry arrived on time, which was a choice. He'd considered arriving 5 minutes early and decided against it, because arriving early said something he didn't want to say about the power balance of the meeting. On time said I take this seriously and I'm here because I want to be, not because I'm eager to please you. The office was the same as it always was. The portraits. Fawkes, who regarded Harry with the ancient warmth of a being for whom last night was simply another evening. The desk, cleared in the way that busy desks were only cleared when someone had made a specific decision about what this meeting was going to look like. Dumbledore offered him tea, which he accepted. He sat down. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "Sir." Harry put his cup down. "You knew Voldemort was in the building since at least September." "I suspected from July," Dumbledore said. He said it without preamble, without qualifying softness, and Harry registered this as a choice Dumbledore had made overnight, to be direct. It was a more significant concession than it might have looked. When Quirrell returned from his travels, there were signs. "And you kept the stone here?" "Yes. Because you wanted to understand what form he'd taken, and what he was capable of." Harry kept his voice even. "And because you wanted to see what I would do if I encountered him." Dumbledore looked at him steadily. "The second reason is the one I'm less comfortable with this morning than I was 3 months ago. Because it worked out. Because you are not who I thought you were." He said this with the directness he'd clearly decided on, and the weight of it was genuine. "I built an expectation of you. I've been carrying it for 10 years. Last night you walked into that room and addressed a situation that has defeated fully trained witches and wizards, and you did it with a clarity of judgment that I did not plan for." Harry listened to this. He let it settle. "I was shaped by what I expected you to be," Dumbledore said. "What I thought you would need to be. I believed that a certain kind of hardship produced a certain kind of strength, and that the strength was necessary." He paused. "I was wrong about that. I was wrong about it in 1981 and I have been wrong about it every year since, and I'd like to tell you plainly." "You've told me," Harry said. "I appreciate it." He meant this. He was not interested in punishing Dumbledore with extended discomfort, that wasn't what the conversation was for. "What I want to know is whether it changes anything going forward." Dumbledore looked at him. "Because there's a prophecy," Harry said. The office went quiet in a particular way. Fawkes made a soft sound. 2 of the portraits stirred. "I found the reference in Flamel's private letters in November," Harry said. "Not the text of it, I don't think I want the text of it, but the existence of it and the general shape of it. That there is a prophecy about me and Voldemort and that it was the reason for several things, including the reason you wanted me somewhere specific and shaped in a particular way." He looked at Dumbledore. "I'm telling you I know about it because I don't want there to be things between us that I know about and you think I don't. That doesn't work for me." Dumbledore was very still. "How long have you known?" "Since early November. I've spent 2 months deciding what I thought about it." "And what do you think?" "I think a prophecy is information, not instruction." Harry picked his tea back up. "I think someone speaking a prediction about the future doesn't determine what I choose to do. I think the version of events where I'm a piece being moved toward a predetermined square is over, and the version where I'm a person making informed decisions about a real situation is what we're doing now." He paused. "I'd like your help with that. I'm asking for it directly, because I think you're one of the most capable people I'm likely to know and I don't want to be at odds with you. But the terms of the help need to be different." Dumbledore looked at him for a long, long time. Through the window the December sky was very blue and very cold, the castle grounds below it white with early frost. "What terms?" he said. "Information. Actual information, not managed glimpses of it. When something is relevant to me, tell me. I'll tell you what I know in return." Harry set the cup down. "I'm going to learn everything I can regardless. You can either be part of that or find out about it after the fact." A pause. And then Dumbledore did something Harry hadn't seen him do before, which was smile without any management in it at all, just a genuine, small, somewhat rueful smile, the expression of a man who recognized checkmate and found he didn't entirely mind. "Your mother argued exactly like that," he said. "She used the same structure." Harry felt something move in him. He let it, briefly. "Margaret says that too," he said. "She knew her a little, through order work. She was remarkable." The word was quiet and direct and meant precisely what it said. "Yes," Harry said. She was. They drank their tea. And then they talked, actually talked, for 2 hours, the first honest conversation Harry thought either of them had fully meant, ranging across the prophecy and its text, which Dumbledore gave him without further hedging, and the nature of the Horcruxes, which Dumbledore suspected but had not confirmed, and the question of what the years ahead would require. Harry asked questions and Dumbledore answered them with a thoroughness that suggested he'd made a decision and was committed to it, and Harry pushed back twice on things that seemed like the old managed information approach and Dumbledore caught himself both times and revised. It wasn't fixed. Harry wasn't naive enough to think 2 hours undid 10 years of a particular pattern. But it was different, and the difference was real, and that was enough to work with. He left the office at 4 o'clock and walked down the corridor toward the library because there were things he wanted to look up now that he had the full text of the prophecy in his head, and he was halfway there when he turned and went in a different direction instead. The dungeons. The corridor he'd walked down twice a week for 3 months, the door he knew well now, the particular quality of silence in the rooms down here that was different from the silence elsewhere in the castle. He knocked. "Come in," Snape said. The office was the same. Books, shelves, the faint chemical undertone of potions materials, the desk with its organized piles. Snape was grading, which he apparently did at all hours, as far as Harry could tell, grading being the ceaseless condition of his existence. He looked up when Harry came in with the expression he used specifically for Harry, which was not welcoming and not unwelcoming and contained somewhere inside it a quality that Harry had spent 3 months trying to name. "Potter," he said. "Sir." Harry sat down in the chair. Not the student chair, that was the one in front of the desk, the one you sat in when you'd been called here for something official. The chair to the side, the one he'd been sitting in on Thursdays. "I talked to Dumbledore. I'm aware you had a meeting. He told me about the prophecy. The full text." Snape put his quill down. "I told him the terms of the relationship going forward," Harry said. "He agreed. I think he meant it." He paused. "I wanted to tell you, because I think you've been managing the gap between what he tells you and what you know I'd want to know for months, and I'd rather that gap didn't exist." Snape looked at him. "You're telling me your conversation with the headmaster." "I'm telling you I made a decision about how my relationship with the headmaster works." "You're adjacent to that decision." Harry stopped. He wasn't usually imprecise. He tried again. "You've been paying attention to this situation in ways that aren't covered by your job description. I wanted you to know I see that." The office was very quiet. From somewhere in the dungeon corridor came the distant sound of Peeves trying to open a suit of armor, which meant it was sometime between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. "You said last night," Snape said, "that you already knew. About Privet Drive." "Yes." "How long?" "Margaret told me before I came to Hogwarts. She told me what she knew, not who, she didn't know who. She knew someone had sent the memories, that the person had clearly been there, that they'd used a sophisticated seal keyed to Amelia Bones' magical signature." Harry looked at him. "I worked out the rest over the first few weeks. You knew me in a way that needed explaining. The way you argued with me felt like someone who'd been watching for a long time. The potions puzzle." He paused. "It felt like the same mind." Snape's expression did not change significantly. But something in the quality of the stillness did. "I've been wanting to say thank you," Harry said, "since about October. I kept deciding it wasn't the right moment. Last night in a corridor in front of McGonagall and Dumbledore was the right moment. I decided you'd been quiet about it long enough." Snape looked at him. And the thing in his expression that Harry had been trying to name for 3 months, he could see it clearly now, partly because the conversation last night had shifted something and partly because he was looking for it properly. It was not pride exactly. It was the expression of a man who had done one thing cleanly and had not expected the cleanness to be seen, and was still adjusting to the fact of being seen. "You were wrong about one thing," Snape said. Harry waited. You said I chose her son over his plan. The reference to Dumbledore was not stated but clear. I didn't know you well enough to choose you. I chose not to participate in something that was going to destroy someone, when I had the ability to stop it. He paused. That's a smaller thing. I don't think it's smaller, Harry said. Doing something because it's right rather than because you know the outcome is usually harder, not easier. He met Snape's gaze. Margaret told me there was someone standing in the cold for hours, watching, making sure. That's not a small thing. Snape looked at the wall. He looked at it for a moment with the expression of a man who has received something and is deciding what to do with it. You should go, he said. You'll have missed dinner. Probably. Harry stood up. He picked up his bag. At the door he stopped, because stopping at the door was apparently a habit both of them had developed over 3 months of Thursday sessions, a place where things that hadn't been said in the room got said on the way out of it. My mother, Harry said. Will you tell me about her sometime? Margaret knows some things but, you knew her before Hogwarts, didn't you? The silence was different from the earlier ones. Not defensive. Just heavy, in the way that long things were heavy when you finally picked them up. Yes, Snape said. I knew her before Hogwarts. Okay, Harry said. There's no rush. He opened the door. Thursday? Chapter 26, Snape said. Don't be late. Harry went down the corridor and up the stairs, and the castle settled around him in its evening mode, the torches going gold, the sound of students moving toward common rooms, the smell of dinner coming up from somewhere, and he walked through it feeling like himself, fully, cleanly himself, in a way that he thought was just what it felt like to have grown up right. The Amelia Bones meeting happened on the last day of term. Harry hadn't expected it. He'd been in the library finishing an essay when McGonagall appeared and said there was someone in the headmaster's office asking to see him, and her expression told him it was important without telling him why. Amelia Bones was smaller than he'd imagined. He'd built a picture over the years from what Margaret had told him, formidable, precise, a woman whose relationship with the law was genuinely principled rather than merely official, and the picture had been roughly accurate except for the scale of it. She was compact and silver-haired and wore square glasses and sat in Dumbledore's office as though she'd sat in important offices her whole career and had a calibrated sense of how much weight to give them. She stood when Harry came in and offered her hand and he shook it. Harry, she said. I'm Amelia Bones. I'm not sure if I know who you are, Harry said. He sat down. Margaret told me. You're the reason I was in Edinburgh instead of Surrey. Something moved in her expression, not surprise exactly, more the expression of someone who'd been carrying something at a particular weight for a long time and had just found it briefly lighter. I was hoping to meet you at some point, she said. I'm sorry it's taken this long. You've been busy, Harry said. I've been following the Wisengamot work. She blinked. You've been building a case against Lucius Malfoy's ministry interference for 3 years, Harry said. It's in the public records if you know how to read them. He paused. I know how to read them. She looked at him for a moment and then looked at Dumbledore, who was sitting behind his desk with the expression of someone who had spent the morning updating his picture of Harry Potter and had not quite finished. I wanted to tell you, she said, refocusing, what happened. In 1981. I know Margaret gave you the broad version but I thought you deserved to hear it from me. What I did and why. I'd like that, Harry said. She told him. She was precise about it, the box, the letter, the memories, the 3 days of building the case, the morning at Privet Drive. She described the Dursleys with a specificity that was clearly drawn from detailed memory, and she described Petunia's face when she opened the door, and she described picking Harry up in the hallway and saying hello. Harry listened to all of it. He listened with the quality he brought to things that mattered, the full attention of someone who understood that this was not a story about the past but about what it meant that the past had gone differently. The relief I felt getting you out of that house, she said, is not something I've been entirely able to describe in all the years since. She paused. I've wondered about you a great deal. Margaret gave me regular updates, Harry said, with a small smile. I think she thought you worried. She was right. Amelia looked at him steadily. You're very settled. I had a good home. You did. She nodded, and the nod had weight behind it. That matters more than people account for. Yes, Harry said. I know. She left the office shortly after, with a handshake that held a moment longer than formal, and Harry watched her go and thought about the chain of it, one anonymous letter, one woman who'd decided to act on it, 10 years of Edinburgh, and here. The astonishing contingency of who you became depending on who decided to do the right thing and when. He thought about going back to the dungeons and decided he'd say it to Snape on Thursday. He had a lot of Thursdays ahead of him. The last evening of term had the particular atmosphere of a school releasing its held breath, students packing trunks, owls carrying early letters home, the great hall for the final dinner buzzing with the specific energy of people who had survived something together and were briefly conscious of it. Harry sat between Ron and Hermione and across from Neville and felt the particular quality of this exact arrangement, these specific people, this moment, and let himself feel it without categorizing it. Ron was describing, in full and enthusiastic detail, the chess game to 3 fifth-years who'd sought him out specifically to hear about it, his hands moving to show the positions, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done the thing and knew it, and Harry watched him and thought that Ron's easy confidence in his own competence was one of the best things he'd seen this year. Hermione was reading. She was at a dinner table at the end-of-term feast reading, which was so purely herself that Harry felt a specific fondness for it. She was reading and occasionally looking up to correct something Ron said about the chessboard, and going back to her book without waiting to see if the correction landed, because she knew it was right and the acknowledgement was secondary. Neville was talking to Hannah Abbott from Hufflepuff about plants. He'd grown 3 inches since September and the growth had changed something in how he held himself, the slight curve of a boy who didn't quite believe he was allowed to take up his full space slowly straightening out. Harry looked at the staff table. McGonagall was eating with the upright composure she always ate with, but there was something slightly relaxed in it tonight, the end-of-term releasing of a held breath that happened to everyone, even Minerva McGonagall. Dumbledore was talking to Flitwick about something that was making Flitwick laugh. Snape was eating and looking at nothing in particular, or at the specific nothing that was actually general observation, and as Harry watched, he looked down the hall and their eyes met for a moment. Harry raised his glass slightly. Snape looked at him for 1 second and then looked away, which was approximately the amount of acknowledgement Harry had come to expect and found entirely sufficient. The thing about Snape, he'd decided, was that he was a person who communicated through what he didn't say as much as through what he did, and you had to be paying attention to read both. Most people weren't paying attention. Harry was always paying attention. He thought about next year. He thought about what he'd asked Dumbledore, and what Dumbledore had told him about the Horcruxes, not all of it, because some of it was theoretical, but enough that Harry had a shape of what the coming years would need to hold. He didn't find this oppressive. He found it clarifying, the way having an accurate map was clarifying even when the territory was difficult. He was going to need to be much better than he currently was. At defense, obviously, he'd been learning the theory but the practice was inconsistent and he knew it. At transfiguration. At understanding the specific mechanics of dark magic, not to use it but to understand it, which was the only way to defend against it properly. He had a reading list forming that was going to require several summers. He also needed to talk to Margaret about the Horcrux theory, because Margaret had been an Auror for 15 years and had been present at several of the major confrontations of the last war and her tactical knowledge was a resource he hadn't yet used properly. He had plans. He had good people. He had, improbably, a spy in the Death Eater structure who had chosen one quiet right action in the dark of a November morning and turned it into the whole shape of Harry's life, and who graded essays in the dungeons and argued about potions theory and was going to tell him about his mother sometime. Hermione looked up from her book. "What are you thinking about?" "Next year," Harry said. We've not finished this year yet. I finished the essays. I've read ahead in every subject. I have thoughts about summer reading. He picked up his pumpkin juice. I'm ready for next year. She looked at him with the expression she'd been developing over the past 3 months, the one that was specific to Harry and contained approximately equal parts exasperation and affection. You're completely mad, you know that. Margaret says eccentric is the more accurate term. Margaret is diplomatic. She's really not. She described my reading speed as alarming. Ron leaned in from the other side. Are you two having the argument about whether Harry reads too fast again? Because I've decided there is no such thing as reading too fast and I'm with Harry on this one, sorry Hermione. You've never voluntarily read anything more than 4 pages long. That's a completely different point. Neville looked at all 3 of them with the expression of someone who had acclimated to this specific conversational dynamic and found it pleasant background noise. Are you all staying in touch over summer? He asked. Yes, said all 3 of them, simultaneously, and then looked at each other. Good, Neville said, and went back to Hannah Abbott. The feast wound down. The Hogwarts Express was in the morning, the long ride back to London, the station and the parting and the summer. Harry would go to Edinburgh. The Callaways would be back from France by the time he arrived. Margaret would want the full account of the year and he would give it to her, completely and in order, because she deserved that and because talking it through with her would help him think about it. He would write to Amelia Bones. He'd decided this over dinner, she'd given him something by coming, the direct account, the handshake, and he wanted to write back. Not formally. Just to say he'd been thinking about the chain of it, and that he was glad she'd been the person who received the box. He would come back in September. He thought about the castle, the specific quality of it, the stone and the staircases and the lake in its pewter autumn and the way the great hall looked from the door on the first night, all the candles floating. He thought about the smell of the dungeons and the precise ordering of Snape's desk and McGonagall's grip on his shoulder in the corridor last night. He thought about Quirrell on the floor and Voldemort's red eyes and the word curious and what that meant about the years ahead. He was not afraid of what came next. He was interested in it, which was different, and better, and entirely his own. The morning was clear and cold, the Hogwarts Express steaming at the platform with its particular red permanence, students and trunks and owls flowing toward it. Harry stood on the steps of the castle for a moment before going down, just for a moment, looking at all of it. Snape was at the top of the steps. He was there the way he was usually somewhere, efficiently present without making an event of it, watching the departure with the detached attention of a man doing his job. Harry looked up at him. "See you in September," he said. Snape said nothing. Harry started down the steps. Behind him, "Don't spend the summer reading only potions texts. The defense theory for 3rd year is more complex than most students realize and you'll need the groundwork." Harry stopped on the step. He was smiling, which Snape couldn't see from behind him, which was fine. "Any recommendations?" "I'll have a list for you. I'll send it with the school owl by the end of the month." Chapter 1 by September. Chapter 3, Snape said. "Don't be slow about it." Harry went down the steps and across the grounds toward the train, toward Ron waving from a window and Hermione already in a compartment with a book, toward the long ride south and Edinburgh in December and Margaret's kitchen and the summer's work ahead of him, and he carried all of it, the year, the stone, the conversations, the one clean action taken in the dark of a November morning that had given him all of this. He carried it easily, because it was his. The train moved. The castle diminished behind it through the window, white with frost in the December morning, and Harry watched it go until the track curved and it was gone, and then turned back to his friends and started talking about next year. In the castle, Severus Snape stood at the top of the steps long after the train had gone, as though there were still something to watch. The grounds were empty. The frost was burning off in the morning sun. Fawkes called once from somewhere above, the pure ascending note of him, and then was quiet. Snape went inside. He went to his office. He sat at his desk. He opened the drawer, the bottom left, the one he rarely opened in front of anyone, and took out an envelope, old now, 10 years old, the parchment soft with age. He unfolded it and looked at it, though there was nothing written on it anymore. He'd transferred the writing to memory years ago, the same memory he carried of Privet Drive in the dark and the first light coming on and the door closing against the sound. He put the blank parchment on the desk and looked at it. Then he opened the drawer again and took out the letter that Harry had left on his desk before last night's events. He hadn't said when. Harry had his own access to the dungeon's corridor and had never once abused it, written in the notebook shorthand Harry used, decoded in a brief handwritten key at the bottom in case Snape couldn't read it. It was short. I know what you did on November 1st, 1981. I know you've never told anyone. I know you didn't do it for recognition or for Dumbledore or for anyone's gratitude. I think you did it because it was right and because she would have wanted it. I just wanted you to know I know. You gave me everything I have by doing one thing cleanly in the dark. Thank you for the night you chose her son over his plan. Snape sat with it in the quiet of his office, in the empty castle, in the December morning. He put it in the drawer where he kept his photographs of Lily. It fit there, in the space between them, as though it had always been meant to. He picked up his quill. He had a reading list to write.